My family stole my entire future 12 years ago and handed it to my golden child brother on a silver platter. They called it a family investment. But when I sat in a luxury hospital suite and listened to a doctor say my brother needed a kidney to survive, my mother did not ask me to save his life. She ordered me to. She looked me dead in the eye and said I owed them my organs. This is the story of how my simple refusal ignited a war that tore down a multi-million-dollar empire of lies. My name is Harrison, and this time my silence had a price. I was sitting at my desk at the accounting firm staring at spreadsheets until my eyes burned when the phone call came. It was my mother, Judith. Her voice was shrill, panicked, and carrying that familiar tone of absolute command that I had spent my entire life obeying. She told me to get to Oakwood Memorial Hospital immediately. She did not explain why. She just said Cameron was in trouble and I needed to be there. Oakwood Memorial is the kind of private hospital that looks more like a 5-star resort than a medical facility. When I walked through the sliding glass doors, my cheap off-the-rack suit felt instantly out of place against the marble floors and grand piano in the lobby. I took the elevator up to the VIP wing. My chest was tight. Despite everything, Cameron was still my brother. I found room 412. The door was slightly open. I pushed it wide and stepped inside. Cameron was sitting up in a massive mechanical bed. He was 36 years old, the hotshot CEO of a tech startup that had been plastered all over local business magazines for the last 3 years. Even in a hospital gown, he looked like he was preparing for a board meeting. Beside him stood his wife Jessica, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than my car. My mother Judith was pacing at the foot of the bed, wringing her hands, her gold jewelry clinking together in the quiet room. None of them looked happy to see me. They looked like they were waiting for an employee to arrive. The doctor, a tall man with silver hair and a crisp white coat, stood near the monitor. He looked from Cameron to me, then back to my mother. He cleared his throat and delivered the news with sterile precision. Cameron was in stage 4 renal failure. His kidneys were shutting down. The deterioration was aggressive, and standard dialysis would only buy him a limited amount of time. He needed a transplant. A living donor was his best chance at survival, and family members were statistically the highest probability for a match. The doctor excused himself to let us process the news. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving the 4 of us alone in the suffocating silence of the VIP suite. I looked at my brother. I felt a pang of genuine fear for him. I opened my mouth to ask what the next steps were, to ask how long he had been sick. But before I could form a single word, my mother spun around and pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Harrison, you need to go down to the lab right now," she said. Her voice was not shaking with grief. It was hard and sharp. "The doctor said they can do the blood work and tissue typing in an hour. We need to get you prepped for surgery by the end of the month." I froze. I blinked, trying to process what she had just said. I looked at Jessica, who was nodding in agreement, and then at Cameron, who would not even meet my eyes. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "We just found out he is sick 2 minutes ago. We do not even know what is happening yet. We know exactly what is happening." Jessica snapped. She stepped forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor. "Cameron is dying. Your brother is dying, Harrison. The doctor just said a family member is the best match. You are his blood. You need to get tested right this second." The sheer entitlement in her voice hit me like a physical blow. There was no request. There was no pleading. There was no tearful conversation about the risks of organ donation or what this would mean for my life, my health, or my career. They were looking at me the same way you look at a spare tire in the trunk of a car. I was just a part. They needed to keep Cameron moving forward. "Wait a minute," I said, raising my hands. "You are telling me to go give away a piece of my body without even having a conversation about it. You are demanding my kidney like you are ordering takeout." Judith crossed her arms, her face twisting into an ugly scowl. "How dare you be so selfish at a time like this? Your brother has a company to run. He has hundreds of employees relying on him. He has a wife. You are a single auditor sitting in a cubicle all day. What exactly do you need 2 kidneys for anyway? You can live perfectly fine with one, and Cameron needs it to survive. You owe us this." The word echoed in the sterile room. Oh. Something deep inside me, something I had buried for 12 long years, suddenly clawed its way to the surface. The anger I had swallowed, the humiliation I had accepted, the future I had sacrificed to keep the peace in this family. It all rushed into my throat. "I owe you," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I owe you." Cameron finally looked up from his hospital bed. "Do not start this right now, Harrison," he muttered, rubbing his temples like I was giving him a headache. "I am sick. Just do what Mom says and get the blood test. We will take care of your medical bills. I will even cut you a check for your missed time at work. Just stop making this about you." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Stop making this about me. You want to cut me open, take my organ, and you are telling me to stop making it about me." I took a step closer to the bed. The fear I had felt for my brother a moment ago was completely gone, replaced by a cold, blinding rage. "Let us talk about what I owe this family," I said, staring directly into my mother's eyes. "Let us talk about 12 years ago. Let us talk about my college fund." Judith rolled her eyes and threw her hands up in the air. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she groaned. "Are we really doing this right now? Are you really bringing up ancient history when your brother is sitting here fighting for his life?" "It is not ancient history to me," I fired back, my voice echoing off the walls. "Grandfather left me $80,000. He put it in a trust for my education so I could go to a top university and build a life for myself. And what did you and Dad do? You drained it. You forged my signature, drained my entire future, and handed every single penny of it to Cameron so he could save his first ridiculous startup company from bankruptcy." Cameron shifted uncomfortably in his bed. "That was a family investment," he said defensively. "Dad made a financial decision." "Dad stole from me to cover your failures," I shouted. "I was 22 years old. I had to drop out of school. I had to work 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford a cheap online degree while you took my money. Lost it all anyway, and then got another loan from Dad to start your next business. And when I confronted you both, what did you call me? You called me a selfish pariah. You said family helps family and that I was ungrateful for demanding my own money back." Jessica scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You are pathetic, Harrison. You have held on to a grudge for over a decade because you are jealous of Cameron's success. He built a massive tech company. He is a multimillionaire. You audit tax returns for mid-level dental supply companies. You were never going to do anything important with that money anyway. Cameron put it to good use." She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "And now you are holding his life hostage because you are bitter." I stared at her, then at my mother, and finally at Cameron. They truly believed their own lies. They believed that because Cameron drove a luxury car and lived in a mansion, his life was inherently more valuable than mine. They believed that my body, my health, and my future were just resources for them to harvest whenever Cameron made a mistake or needed a bailout. "You are right," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I audit tax returns. I live a quiet, predictable life, and I like my life. I have worked incredibly hard to rebuild everything you people stole from me, and I'm not going to let you tear me open to fix another one of Cameron's problems." Judith stepped right up to me, her face red with fury. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little boy. You are going to walk down to that lab, you are going to get tested, and you are going to give your brother that kidney. You are family. You do not have a choice." I looked down at her. I felt the last remaining thread connecting me to this family snap completely. "I do have a choice," I said, "and my answer is no." The room exploded. "You cannot say no!" Jessica screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of my cheap suit. "You are a monster. You are going to let your own brother die. You are a disgusting, vindictive loser." I shoved her hands off my chest and took a step back. "I am not letting him die. I am just refusing to be the sacrificial lamb for this family anymore. Find another donor. Buy one on the black market with all that tech money you brag about. I do not care." Before I could turn toward the door, my mother swung her arm back and slapped me directly across the face. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The sting radiated across my cheek, hot and sharp. I stood there frozen, staring at the woman who had brought me into this world. Her chest was heaving, her eyes wild with rage. "You are dead to me." Judith spat, her voice trembling with hatred. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer my son. You are nothing. You hear me? You are nothing." I reached up and touched my cheek. The physical pain was nothing compared to the absolute clarity I felt in that moment. For 34 years, I had tried to earn their respect. I had shown up to every holiday dinner. I had kept my mouth shut while they flaunted their wealth. I had played the role of the quiet, obedient younger brother. But none of it mattered. I was just spare parts to them. "I am already nothing to you, Mom," I said quietly. "I always have been." I turned my back on them and walked out the door. "Harrison, come back here!" Cameron yelled from the bed, his voice cracking with panic. "Harrison!" I did not stop. I walked down the long carpeted hallway of the VIP wing, ignoring the stares of the nurses at the central station. I pushed through the heavy double doors, stepped into the elevator, and hit the button for the ground floor. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands were shaking, and my face still burned from the slap. But as the elevator descended, I did not feel regret. I felt free. I walked out into the cool afternoon air, unlocked my 10-year-old sedan, and sat in the driver's seat. I took a deep breath, resting my forehead against the steering wheel. I knew what I had just done. I had not just refused a medical procedure. I had declared war on people who possessed massive financial resources and social influence. I knew they were not going to let this go. I knew they would try to destroy whatever small, quiet life I had managed to build for myself. But what I did not know as I started my car and drove away from Oakwood Memorial Hospital was exactly how far they were willing to go to ruin me. I did not know that within 48 hours my entire life would be systematically dismantled. And I certainly did not know that their ruthless campaign to force me into submission would accidentally lead me straight to a $60 million secret that would tear their entire fake empire straight to the ground. My phone started buzzing in the passenger seat. It was my boss at the accounting firm. The destruction had already begun. I thought walking out of that hospital room was the end of the nightmare. I truly believed that by saying no, I had severed the toxic cord binding me to my family, and I could simply return to my quiet, ordinary life. I was naive. I had vastly underestimated the absolute ruthlessness of my brother Cameron and his wife Jessica. When you strip away the designer clothes and the polished smiles, they were predators. And I had just given them a reason to hunt me. The destruction of my life did not take weeks or even days. It took less than 18 hours. It started before I even woke up the next morning. My phone had been vibrating on my nightstand all night long. When I finally picked it up at 6 in the morning, my screen was flooded with hundreds of notifications. Missed calls, angry text messages, and social media tags from people I barely knew. Cameron and Jessica were not just wealthy socialites. They were the crowning jewels of Grace Fellowship, a massive suburban megachurch that boasted thousands of members. The congregation included local politicians, real estate developers, and corporate executives. Jessica did not waste a single second grieving her husband's diagnosis. She weaponized it. She immediately went to her vast network of prayer groups and elite Bible studies, spinning a perfectly crafted narrative of tragedy and betrayal. In her version of the story, Cameron was a benevolent, charitable entrepreneur tragically struck down in his prime by a random disease. And I was the bitter, godless younger brother who was intentionally watching him die over a petty childhood misunderstanding. She did not mention the $80,000 my parents stole from my college fund. She did not mention the 12 years of financial abuse. She painted me as a monster holding a life-saving organ hostage. By the time I drank my morning coffee, the smear campaign had gone completely viral within our community. People I had known for years were sending me messages calling me a murderer. One message from a high school friend simply read, I hope you burn for what you are doing to your own flesh and blood. I deleted the apps from my phone, feeling sick to my stomach. I put on my suit, grabbed my briefcase, and drove to work, telling myself that the hysteria would fade. I just needed to focus on my job. My career was the one thing I had built entirely on my own, completely independent of my family. I worked as a senior auditor at a prestigious regional accounting firm. I was good at my job. I was reliable, meticulous, and I kept my head down. But the moment I stepped out of the elevator and walked into the corporate bullpen, I knew something was horribly wrong. The usual morning chatter died instantly. Keyboards stopped clacking. Dozens of my coworkers turned their heads away, refusing to make eye contact with me. The silence was thick and suffocating. I walked to my cubicle, my heart pounding against my ribs, and sat down. Before I could even turn on my computer, the administrative assistant approached my desk. She did not smile. She just told me that Mr. Caldwell, the managing partner of the firm, needed to see me in his office right away. I walked down the glass-walled corridor, feeling like a man walking to his execution. I knocked once and stepped into the massive corner office. Mr. Caldwell was standing by the window looking out at the city skyline. He did not offer me a seat. "Harrison," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral, "we are going to have to let you go, effective immediately." I stood there completely stunned. The words did not make any sense. I had just billed 80 hours the previous week. I had caught a major compliance error that saved our biggest client thousands of dollars in penalties. I was the top-performing auditor in my division. "Let me go," I asked, my voice shaking. "On what grounds? My performance reviews have been flawless for 5 straight years." Mr. Caldwell sighed and finally turned to face me. He looked deeply uncomfortable, but his eyes were hard. "We are doing some sudden corporate restructuring, Harrison. Your position is being eliminated. Human Resources has already packed up your personal items. Security will escort you to the parking garage." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I looked at the framed photographs on Mr. Caldwell's desk. Right next to a picture of his family was a silver plaque. It was an award from Grace Fellowship thanking him for his generous financial contributions to the church building fund. Suddenly, all the pieces snapped together in my mind. "This is not a restructuring," I said, taking a step forward. 3 members of the executive board at this firm are elders at Grace Fellowship. My sister-in-law goes to the same country club as your wife. They made a phone call, did they not? Mr. Caldwell stiffened. His professional mask slipped just a fraction. "I strongly advise you not to make a scene, Harrison. The firm cannot afford to employ a moral liability. You are a public relations disaster waiting to happen. The board feels that a man who would gleefully watch his own brother die is not a man we can trust with our clients' financial futures. I am sorry, but the decision is final. You will receive no severance package. We consider this termination for cause under the morality clause of your contract." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear his office apart and explain exactly what Cameron had done to me. I wanted to tell him about my stolen college fund and the years of emotional blackmail. But I looked into Mr. Caldwell's eyes and saw exactly what I had seen in my mother's eyes at the hospital. He had already made up his mind. I was the villain, and nothing I said was going to change the narrative. I nodded, slowly, turned around, and walked out of the office. 2 security guards were waiting for me by my cubicle. They handed me a small cardboard box containing my coffee mug and a few framed photos, then marched me through the bullpen like a convicted criminal. Every single person in the office watched me leave. 12 years of working my fingers to the bone. 12 years of trying to be the responsible, self-sufficient brother wiped out by a single phone call from a wealthy, vindictive woman. I carried my box to my car, tossing it into the passenger seat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I had lost my family and my career, but I told myself I still had a foundation. I still had Sarah. Sarah and I had been engaged for 8 months. We were planning a modest autumn wedding. She was a marketing manager, bright, ambitious, and deeply concerned with appearances. I had always thought her focus on social standing was just a quirk, something we could balance out together. I drove back to our shared apartment, desperate for a friendly face. I needed her to hold me and tell me we were going to get through this together. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. The apartment was a disaster zone. Suitcases were unzipped on the living room rug. Sarah was frantically throwing clothes, shoes, and toiletries into a large canvas bag. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed with panic. When she heard the door click shut, she jumped and spun around to face me. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I asked, dropping my cardboard box onto the kitchen counter. She did not run to comfort me. She took a step back, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and absolute disgust. "I am leaving Harrison," she said, her voice sharp and trembling. "I am packing my things and I am going to stay with my sister." I stared at her completely unmoored. Leaving. Why? Because I got fired. "I can find another job, Sarah. We have some savings. I can bounce back from this." "This is not about your job," she screamed, throwing a handful of blouses into her suitcase. "This is about you. Do you have any idea what my morning has been like? My phone has not stopped ringing since 7 o'clock. The women in my spin class, the girls in my bridal party, my boss. Everyone is asking me why I am engaged to a sociopath." I felt the floor drop out from under me. "Jessica got to you too," I whispered. "Jessica did not have to get to me," Sarah snapped, zipping her suitcase with violent force. "The whole world knows what you did. You stood in a hospital room and told your dying brother you hope he rots. You refused a simple blood test. You are holding his life hostage because you are still crying about some money your parents borrowed a decade ago." "Borrowed," I yelled, the betrayal cutting deeper than the loss of my job. "They stole it, Sarah. They ruined my life to cover for Cameron's failures, and now they want my organs to cover his medical failures. You know the truth. I told you everything." "I do not care about the money, Harrison," she shrieked, tears of frustration spilling down her cheeks. "I care about my life. I care about my reputation. We live in this community. We go to these grocery stores. I am not going to spend the rest of my life walking into rooms where people whisper behind my back because my husband is a hated outcast. I am not going to tie myself to a man who would let his own flesh and blood die just to prove a point." She walked over to the coffee table, pulled the diamond engagement ring off her finger, and slammed it down onto the glass. The sharp clink of the metal sounded like a final gavel dropping on my life. "You are a cold, broken person, Harrison. I cannot be with a monster." She grabbed her suitcases, shoved past me without another word, and walked out the front door. I stood in the dead silence of the living room, staring at the glittering diamond ring on the table. In less than 24 hours, my brother's failing kidney had cost me my family, my income, my reputation, and my future wife. But the absolute bottom was still waiting for me. 30 minutes later, there was a loud, aggressive pounding on my front door. I opened it to find my landlord, a burly, uncompromising man who owned half the rental properties in the neighborhood. He did not look at me with any sympathy. "I need you out, Harrison," he said bluntly. I shook my head, exhausted beyond measure. "I told you yesterday I just need another week. I drained my savings paying off the last of my late father's hospital bills. I will get you the back rent." The landlord crossed his arms. "You will not get me the back rent because you just got fired from your firm. Word travels fast in this town. You are 2 months behind Harrison. The grace period is over. You have until sundown to get your things out of my property, or I am calling the sheriff to drag you out for trespassing." He turned and walked down the hallway, leaving me staring at the empty corridor. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened my banking app. The screen loaded, displaying the final pathetic reality of my existence. My available balance was exactly $42.15. I was completely, utterly ruined. I was broke, dumped, blacklisted, and about to be homeless. The smear campaign had worked flawlessly. Cameron and Jessica had successfully isolated me from every support system I had. They thought by destroying my life they would force me to crawl back to the hospital on my knees and beg to give them my kidney just to end the pain. But they miscalculated. They pushed me so far into the dirt that I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I grabbed some heavy-duty trash bags from the kitchen pantry and began furiously stuffing my clothes, my winter coats, and my few remaining personal items into them. I left the furniture. I left the television. I left the engagement ring sitting right there on the coffee table. I carried my trash bags down to my old sedan and threw them into the back seat. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the dashboard, wondering where a man with $42 goes to sleep. I could not afford a motel. I could not go to a shelter without risking someone recognizing me from the church's aggressive social media posts. There was only one place left on earth that I legally owned. When my father Walter passed away 3 years ago, he left the entire estate, the cash, the stocks, the family home to my mother and Cameron. The only thing he left to me was a single baffling piece of property. It was the deed to an abandoned, bankrupt self-storage facility on the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. Everyone thought it was a final insult from my father. The place was structurally condemned, buried in back taxes, and totally unsellable. I put the car in drive and headed toward the industrial district. The drive took 40 minutes, taking me far away from the manicured lawns and luxury hospitals of my former life. I pulled onto a cracked, weed-choked asphalt lot and parked in front of a massive chain-link fence. The sign above the gate was faded and rusted, barely legible. The storage facility was a sprawling nightmare of corrugated metal buildings, overgrown vines, and collapsing roofs. The wind howled through the empty corridors between the units, making the loose metal doors bang and rattle like ghosts haunting a graveyard. It was the most bleak, depressing place I had ever seen. I grabbed a pair of heavy bolt cutters from my trunk, walked up to the main gate, and snapped the rusted padlock. I drove my car inside, parking in front of a long row of orange metal doors. The cold evening air was biting, cutting straight through my thin suit jacket. I walked up to Unit 12, cut the lock, and hauled the heavy metal door upward. The inside was a 10x10 concrete box smelling of dust, mildew, and engine oil. It was freezing dark and entirely empty. I dragged my trash bags of clothes inside. I laid them out on the freezing concrete floor, creating a makeshift mattress. I sat down in the absolute darkness of the metal box, pulling my winter coat tightly around my shoulders. I was 34 years old. I had played by the rules my entire life, and my reward was sitting in a freezing, rusted metal cage while my brother sat in a luxury hospital bed surrounded by people who loved him. This was rock bottom. This was the dark, miserable end of the road they had paved for me. But as I sat there shivering in the dark, staring at the corrugated metal walls that my father had inexplicably left to me, I had no idea that I was quite literally sitting on top of the weapon that would destroy them all. I woke up shivering uncontrollably. The concrete floor of Unit 12 was like a solid block of ice, pulling every ounce of heat from my body through the thin plastic trash bags I was using as a makeshift mattress. It was late November, and the bitter wind off the industrial district ripped through the gaps in the corrugated metal door. For a man who had spent the last 10 years in climate-controlled high-rise offices, this level of brutal cold was a physical shock. Every morning started the exact same way. I would wake up long before the sun, my breath turning to thick white fog in the dark. I would walk out into the freezing alleyway, splash freezing water on my face from a rusted spigot near the main gate, put on my least wrinkled suit jacket over a heavy wool sweater, and grab my heavy steel bolt cutters. I was technically the legal owner of this entire bankrupt self-storage facility. My father Walter had left me the deed when he passed away, but ownership meant absolutely nothing when the property was structurally condemned and buried in massive tax liens. I had no electricity, no running water, and no bank account to draw from. To survive, I had to scavenge my own ruined property. According to the crumbling paper ledgers I found in the ruined front office, dozens of these storage units had been abandoned by their renters over 15 years ago. They were legally defaulted. They belonged to me now. So I became a ghost haunting my own graveyard. I spent my days snapping heavy steel padlocks off the doors of forgotten units, hoping to find absolutely anything of value. Most of the time, I found nothing but water-damaged cardboard boxes, moth-eaten mattresses, and garbage. But sometimes I got lucky. I would find an old vintage lamp, a box of tarnished silverware, or a decent set of heavy-duty power tools. I would haul these discarded pieces of other people's lives to the weekend flea market 3 miles down the road. I would stand there in the freezing cold negotiating over $5 bills with aggressive bargain hunters just so I could afford a hot cup of coffee and a cheap sandwich. It was humiliating. Just a few short weeks ago, I was a respected corporate auditor reviewing million-dollar accounts. Now I was haggling over rusted wrenches just to keep from starving to death. My brother Cameron was sitting in a luxury hospital bed surrounded by expensive flowers and sympathy cards, while I was literally digging through trash to stay alive. The sheer injustice of it made my blood boil, but the anger was the only thing keeping me moving. I refused to lay down and die in this place. I refused to let them win. I remembered how my mother used to look at me when I told her about my hard-earned promotions at the accounting firm. There was never any pride in her eyes. There was only a cold calculation wondering if my success could somehow benefit Cameron. When my father drained my $80,000 college fund, he did not even have the decency to look me in the eye. He just signed my name and handed my entire future to my brother. And now, they had taken my career, my fiancé, and my home. They wanted me broken. They wanted me desperate enough to crawl back to Oakwood Memorial Hospital and offer up my kidney just to get back into their good graces. But every time I swung those heavy steel bolt cutters and snapped another lock, my resolve hardened. I would rather freeze on this concrete floor than give those monsters another piece of my body. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the isolation of my rusted fortress was finally broken. I was walking back from the flea market carrying a small bag of groceries I had managed to buy after selling an old leather armchair. My hands were numb, my boots were soaked with dirty slush, and I was exhausted to the bone. As I approached the main gate of the storage facility, I saw it. A brand new, gleaming white Range Rover was parked horizontally right across the entrance. The luxury vehicle looked like an alien spaceship against the bleak backdrop of broken asphalt and rusted metal. I felt a hard knot tighten in my stomach. I knew exactly who owned that car. The driver's side door opened and Jessica stepped out. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere coat and knee-high leather boots that probably cost more than what I used to make in a month. She looked around the decaying facility with a sneer of absolute revulsion, holding a manicured hand over her nose to block the smell of stagnant water and rust. When she saw me walking up the broken road, her sneer turned into a vicious, triumphant smile. She did not look at me like I was a human being. She looked at me like I was a pest that needed to be exterminated. "Look at you, Harrison," she called out, her voice echoing sharply against the metal buildings. "I have to admit, I did not think you would actually sink this low. I thought you would be begging on a street corner by now. But I suppose living in a literal garbage dump is fitting for someone like you. You finally look exactly like what you are. You belong in the dirt." I stopped a few feet away from her. I did not raise my voice. I just stared at her. "What do you want, Jessica?" I asked. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She tossed it onto the wet asphalt at my feet. The paper landed with a wet slap in a puddle of dirty slush. "I want you to read that very carefully," she said, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "Since you decided to be a stubborn, vindictive little boy and walk out of that hospital, we decided to handle this like adults. That is a legal summons, Harrison. My lawyers are officially suing you for intentional infliction of emotional distress." I looked down at the wet envelope, then back up at her, genuinely shocked by the sheer absurdity of her words. "You are suing me?" I asked, my voice flat. "You are suing me because I will not let you cut out my organs. We are suing you because you are actively and maliciously causing your brother's health to decline," she snapped, stepping closer, her face flushed with anger. "You are causing our entire family severe psychological trauma by withholding a life-saving medical procedure out of spite. The lawsuit is for $5 million. And since we already made sure you lost your job and your apartment, we know you cannot afford a lawyer to fight it." She crossed her arms, looking incredibly satisfied with herself. You have two choices. You can let the courts completely destroy whatever is left of your pathetic life. Or you can get in this car right now, drive to the clinic, sign the donor consent forms, and we will drop the case. The choice is yours. Give up the kidney or spend the rest of your miserable life paying off a judgment you can never afford. I stood there in the freezing wind looking at this woman who had helped orchestrate the total destruction of my life. She was using the legal system as a weapon to harvest my body parts. It was so monstrous, so deeply evil that I actually felt a strange, cold sense of calm wash over me. I picked up the wet envelope from the slush. I did not open it. I simply ripped it in half right in front of her face and dropped the pieces back onto the ground. "You and Cameron took my college fund 12 years ago," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You took my job. You took my fiancé. But you are not getting my kidney. I do not care if you sue me for $50 million. I do not care if I die in this scrapyard. You can tell my mother and you can tell your husband that they will never get another thing from me as long as I live. Get off my property." Jessica's smug smile vanished. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are going to regret this," she hissed. "You are going to rot in this place, Harrison." She spun around, climbed back into her luxury SUV and slammed the door. The massive engine roared as she reversed aggressively, the heavy tires kicking up dirty water before she sped away down the broken road. I watched the red tail lights of her vehicle disappear into the gray afternoon. The cold wind bit into my face, but I barely felt it. I was shaking not from the freezing temperature, but from a rage so intense it felt like a physical fire burning inside my chest. I walked through the main gate, my boots crunching heavily on the gravel, and headed deep into the maze of rusted metal buildings. I needed to break something. I needed to swing my heavy bolt cutters and smash through solid steel just to release the immense pressure building inside my head. I walked past the first 3 rows of storage units, heading toward the very back of the sprawling facility. The units back here were the absolute oldest. The metal doors were heavily oxidized, the orange paint peeling away in massive strips. The ground was wildly uneven, cracked by aggressive weeds that had grown thick over the decades. No one had walked down this particular row in years. I stopped in front of Unit 47. It was situated at the dead end of the darkest, most isolated corridor. The padlock on this door was completely different from the others. It was not a standard cheap combination lock. It was a massive, heavy-duty, solid steel industrial lock. It looked incredibly out of place on such a ruined, neglected building. I pulled out my crumbling paper ledger from my coat pocket. I scanned down the long list of defaulted units, running my dirty finger over the faded ink. Unit 47. It was rented 30 years ago under the name William Thorne. My breath caught in my throat. William Thorne was not a real person. It was a fake alias my father Walter used to use when he booked private poker games and discreet hotel rooms. He always thought it made him sound important. My father had personally rented this specific unit, and he had never stopped paying the property tax on this entire bankrupt facility, purposefully keeping it in his name until the day he died. Suddenly, a profound realization hit me. I stared at the heavy steel lock. The words my grandfather had told me on the day of his funeral echoed perfectly in my mind. He had warned me not to be fooled by what people leave behind. It was the day I learned that sometimes the smallest gift carries the biggest secret. My father did not leave me this rotting storage facility as a final cruel insult. He left it to me because he was hiding something incredibly important, and he hid it in the one place he knew Cameron and my mother would never ever look. They were far too proud, too obsessed with high society and luxury status to ever set foot in a place this filthy. But my father knew I was different. He knew I had the grit to survive the dirt. I gripped the heavy rubber handles of my bolt cutters. I wedged the heavy steel jaws perfectly around the thick shackle of the industrial padlock. I braced my boots against the cracked concrete, gritted my teeth, and put every single ounce of my body weight into pushing the handles together. My shoulder muscles screamed in agony. The thick metal groaned in protest. I pushed harder, the veins in my neck bulging, channeling every ounce of anger I had for Jessica, for Cameron, and for my mother directly into my hands. With a loud, sharp crack, the steel shackle snapped in half. The heavy lock hit the concrete floor. I grabbed the rusted handle of the corrugated metal door and pulled upward with all my might. The metal shrieked loudly, the rusted tracks resisting every inch of the way. I pushed the door up past my head and stepped into the absolute darkness of Unit 47. The air inside was incredibly stale and heavy. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and clicked it on. The bright beam of light cut through the thick dust. At first glance, the unit looked like an absolute dumping ground. There were stacks of rotting wooden chairs, a broken dining table, and dozens of unmarked cardboard boxes piled entirely to the ceiling. It looked completely worthless, but I knew my father. He was a meticulous, calculating man who never left things to chance. I set my flashlight down on a nearby wooden crate and started moving the heavy furniture. I hauled the rotting wooden chairs out into the alleyway. I pushed the broken table aggressively to the side. I tore through the cardboard boxes, coughing violently as massive clouds of dust filled the freezing air. I cleared the center of the room, entirely exposing the bare concrete floor. My eyes scanned the ground carefully. In the far back right corner, completely hidden beneath a thick, heavy rubber mat, the concrete looked slightly uneven. I dropped directly to my knees. My heart was pounding so hard I could actually hear it in my ears. I grabbed the heavy edge of the rubber mat and pulled it completely back. Underneath the mat, set perfectly flush into the foundation of the concrete floor, was a square panel made of solid, highly polished steel. It was not a cheap hardware store lockbox. It was a massive, commercial-grade floor safe. And right in the center of the heavy metal door was a digital, biometric keypad. I brushed the thick layer of dust away from the keypad with my trembling fingers. The metal was freezing cold to the touch. This was not the kind of safe you use to store old family photo albums or sentimental trinkets. This was the kind of vault used to hide things that powerful people were willing to kill for. I sat back on my heels, staring intensely at the blinking red light on the keypad. The cold wind, howling frantically outside the unit, suddenly felt very distant. The sharp hunger in my stomach, the deep exhaustion in my bones, the bitter sting of Jessica's $5 million legal threats, all of it faded entirely away into the background. My father had left me this ruined property for a reason. He had left me this hidden vault for a reason. The chaotic pieces of a massive, dangerous puzzle were suddenly starting to connect perfectly in my mind. Cameron's financial desperation, my mother's absolute hysterical insistence that I hand over my kidney immediately, the sudden frantic urgency to keep their golden child functioning at any cost. I looked down at the glowing red light of the biometric scanner. I did not know exactly what my father had buried beneath the concrete of this forgotten scrapyard. But as I reached out to touch the cold steel of the vault, I knew one thing with absolute terrifying certainty. The family that had stripped me of my future, stolen my dignity, and left me to freeze in the dirt had made a fatal miscalculation. They had banished me straight to the one place that held the master key to their complete and total destruction. I sat on the freezing concrete floor, staring at the blinking red light of the digital keypad on the massive floor safe. The biometric scanner was completely dead, meaning the secondary numeric bypass was my only way inside. My hands were numb from the bitter cold, but my mind was racing with a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. My father, Walter, was a man who trusted absolutely no one. He was a ruthless, calculating businessman who viewed the entire world as a balance sheet. He would never use a birth date, a wedding anniversary, or a simple home address for a combination. Those were emotional numbers, and Walter despised emotion. He worshipped money structure and absolute control. As a senior corporate auditor, my entire career was built on finding the hidden numbers that powerful people desperately tried to conceal. I closed my eyes and sifted through my memories of my father's vast financial footprint. I thought about his complex tax returns from a decade ago. I thought about the secondary shell companies he set up to funnel assets out of the state. I typed in the 9-digit employer identification number for his oldest holding company. A red light flashed on the steel door. An angry buzz echoed in the quiet storage unit. Incorrect. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I tried the routing number for his primary offshore trust. The red light flashed again. The small digital screen beeped twice, warning me that I had exactly one attempt left before a permanent internal lockout would seal the vault forever. The pressure in my chest was suffocating. If I failed this last attempt, whatever my father had buried in this wasteland would be lost to me completely. I needed to stop thinking like a son and start thinking like Walter. I needed to focus on the exact moment he started hiding his life from the rest of the world. Then a dark, painful memory hit me with the force of a freight train. The $80,000, my grandfather's college fund. I remembered the exact date the funds were maliciously transferred out of my name, combined with the last 4 digits of the offshore account my father used to facilitate the theft. It was a sequence of numbers permanently burned into my brain because it was the precise moment my future had been stolen to subsidize my brother's arrogance. I reached out my fingers, hovering over the cold metal keys, and pressed the digits into the keypad. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the silent storage unit. The blinking red light turned a solid, vibrant green. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled upward with every ounce of strength I had left. The thick door groaned, revealing a deep fireproof cavity built directly into the foundation of the earth. The smell of old paper and stale air drifted up from the dark hole. I grabbed my flashlight, shined the beam inside, and reached down into the shadows. There was no junk inside this safe. There were no meaningless family heirlooms or sentimental photographs. My fingers brushed against thick, heavy stacks of crisp paper. I pulled the first massive bundle out into the dim light of the storage unit. My breath caught violently in my throat. They were bearer bonds. They were untraceable high-denomination government bonds, tightly bound in heavy rubber bands. I pulled out stack after stack, laying them carefully on the freezing concrete floor. I was a man with exactly $42 in my checking account, sitting in a condemned, rusted metal box surrounded by tens of millions of dollars. I reached deeper into the vault. Beneath the fortune of bearer bonds was a thick black leather ledger, a military-grade encrypted hard drive, and a sealed white envelope. My name was written across the front of the envelope in my father's sharp, aggressive handwriting. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment paper. The words on that page did not just explain my bizarre inheritance. They completely rewrote the entire history of my family. Harrison, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means you have endured the dirt. It means you did not sell this ruined property for a quick payout, and you had the grit to dig deeper than anyone else in this family ever could. You have passed the only test that matters. I know you hate me. I know you believe I stole your college fund 12 years ago to cover Cameron's failures. That was a lie. I did not steal your $80,000 to save his first business. I used it to fund his first crime. I stopped reading. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I brought the flashlight closer to the paper, my eyes scanning the incredibly precise, damning words my father had left behind. The letter detailed a horrifying, unbelievable reality. Cameron's brilliant, highly publicized tech startup was a complete and total fabrication. There was no revolutionary software algorithm. There was no legitimate, sustainable revenue. It was a massive, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. Cameron had spent the last decade paying his early investors with the massive capital he raised from new investors. He had used my stolen college fund as the initial untraceable seed money to establish a complex web of anonymous shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Cameron was not a genius chief executive officer. He was a corporate criminal. And according to my father's meticulous records, Cameron's fake tech empire was currently drowning in $40 million of hidden, highly toxic debt. The entire operation was a fragile house of cards waiting for a strong gust of wind. Walter's letter explained that he always knew Cameron's boundless arrogance would eventually destroy him. He knew that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation would inevitably raid the company headquarters. He knew federal agents would seize the family assets, freeze every bank account tied to the family name, and leave Cameron rotting in a federal penitentiary. To protect the true wealth of our family from Cameron's inevitable destruction, Walter spent the last 5 years of his life secretly liquidating his massive real estate portfolio, his blue-chip stocks, and his private offshore accounts. He converted absolutely everything into $60 million of untraceable bonds and offshore trusts, hiding the master keys, the passwords, and the ledgers in this exact safe. He left the bankrupt, decaying storage facility to me because he knew Cameron and Judith would never, ever step foot in a place so filthy. They were entirely obsessed with the illusion of high society and luxury status. But Walter knew I was different. He knew I had the quiet, unbreakable resilience to survive the absolute worst conditions. He knew I was a seasoned corporate auditor who could easily understand the complex ledgers, and he knew I was the only person with the moral integrity to hold the true family wealth without squandering it on designer suits and flashy sports cars. I gave Cameron the rope to hang himself, my father wrote at the bottom of the page. But I am giving you the power to survive the fall. The empire is yours, Harrison. Do not let them take it. I lowered the letter, letting my hands rest on my knees. I sat in the freezing darkness and let the sheer crushing magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. My entire life had been meticulously manipulated. Every holiday dinner where they openly mocked my modest salary, every time my mother called me a failure, every time Cameron flaunted his massive wealth in my face, it was all built on a massive, rotting lie. They had ruined my professional reputation, destroyed my engagement to Sarah, and driven me into absolute poverty, all to maintain the illusion that Cameron was a god among men. And then the final terrifying piece of the puzzle snapped perfectly into place in my mind. I thought about that luxury hospital suite. I thought about Cameron lying in that mechanical bed looking frantic and desperate. I thought about my mother demanding I undergo surgery immediately, and Jessica threatening to sue me for $5 million just to force me onto an operating table. A man running a $40 million Ponzi scheme cannot afford to be sick. He cannot afford to step away from the boardroom, and he certainly cannot afford a prolonged medical leave. If Cameron vanished into a hospital ward for months of standard dialysis treatments, his wealthy investors would start asking questions. The routine financial audits would begin. The carefully hidden shell companies would instantly collapse. His utter desperation for my kidney was not just about saving his physical life. It was about keeping his fraudulent empire from imploding on national television. Waiting on a national organ donor list meant years of weakness, years of diminished capacity, and years where he could not aggressively charm his investors to keep the stolen money flowing. They did not just need my kidney to cure a disease. They needed my body to keep their criminal scam alive. I looked down at the $60 million resting on the concrete floor. The bitter cold of the storage unit did not bother me anymore. The sharp hunger in my stomach had entirely vanished. I was no longer the broken, humiliated outcast they had banished to the slums. It was the day I learned that sometimes the smallest gift carries the biggest secret, and sometimes the people laughing at you are standing on ground that's about to crumble beneath their feet. I carefully packed the heavy stacks of bearer bonds, the black leather ledger, and the encrypted hard drive back into the massive floor safe. I placed my father's letter gently on top. I closed the heavy steel door, listening to the solid, satisfying click of the locking mechanism engaging. I dragged the thick rubber mat back over the square metal panel, hiding it perfectly from view. I pulled the broken wooden chairs and cardboard boxes back over the spot, ensuring the unit looked exactly like the garbage dump it was supposed to be. When I finally stood up and dusted the dirt off my trousers, my perspective on the world had completely shifted. They had tried to bury me in the dirt, completely unaware that I had just discovered the master key to their absolute ruin. I had the ledger. I had the undeniable truth. I had $60 million of untraceable leverage. I was not going to run. I was not going to hide. I was going to wait in the shadows, and I was going to watch them tear themselves apart. I spent the next 3 weeks living like a ghost inside Unit 47. The brutal Chicago winter had fully set in by that point, and the thick concrete walls of the storage facility felt like the inside of an industrial meat freezer. I had no central heating and no running water. I had to buy a cheap, battered gas generator from the weekend flea market just to keep my laptop powered. I wore 3 layers of clothing, heavy wool socks, and thick, fingerless gloves. I sat on a turned-over plastic crate with the encrypted hard drive plugged directly into my machine. I was starving, exhausted, and practically frozen to the bone, but my mind had never been sharper in my entire life. For 12 years, I had audited the complicated financials of massive regional corporations. I tracked missing pennies across thousands of pages of convoluted tax documents for a living. Cameron and my mother were arrogant enough to believe I was just a quiet, obedient failure who pushed paper at a mid-level firm. They completely forgot that I was a seasoned forensic accountant. And now, sitting in a rotting metal cage, I held the master ledger to the greatest financial fraud my family had ever committed. The encryption on the hard drive was incredibly sophisticated, built to withstand a federal cyber attack. But my father was an old-school man who trusted paper over digital security, and he had left the backdoor access codes written plainly in his handwritten letter. Once I bypassed the firewall, a sprawling, terrifying web of offshore bank accounts. Dummy corporations and wire transfers spilled across my glowing laptop screen. I started my audit at the very beginning. I dug deep into the historical archives and found the exact ledger entry from 12 years ago, a single deposit of exactly $80,000, my stolen college fund. I tracked that exact sum of money as it moved from my grandfather's educational trust, washed through my parents' joint checking account, and funneled straight into an anonymous corporate entity registered in Delaware under Cameron's name. That stolen money was the seed. It was the foundation of his entire criminal lie. From there, I watched the massive fraud multiply right before my eyes. I traced how Cameron used my initial capital to rent a flashy high-end office space downtown. He leased a luxury sports car and printed glossy high-tech marketing materials for a software algorithm that literally did not exist. He faked his early user data. He fabricated entire revenue streams using shell accounts to make it look like his startup was exploding with profit. And then the real money started rolling in. Wealthy investors from his elite country club circles, fellow members of the mega church, and aggressive venture capitalists handed him millions, believing they were getting in on the ground floor of a massive technological revolution. But there was no revolution. The money went straight into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Cameron used the new incoming investments to pay massive fake dividends to the early investors, creating a flawless textbook Ponzi scheme. And just as my father had warned in his letter, the house of cards was finally collapsing. Cameron was currently drowning in $40 million of toxic corporate debt, and the new money had completely dried up. I sat in the freezing dark, staring at the screen, feeling a heavy, sickening weight settle in my stomach. The sheer scale of Cameron's greed was breathtaking. He had built his entire identity, his marriage, and his high society reputation on money he had stolen from his own friends and church members. But as I dug even deeper into his personal expense ledgers, looking for where he was hiding his remaining liquid cash, I found a series of bizarre, highly irregular payments. Over the last 4 months, Cameron had wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to a private, extremely secretive medical concierge clinic located just outside the city limits. The payments were categorized under vague consulting fees, completely hidden from his corporate board of directors and even from his wife, Jessica. I hacked into the attached medical invoices saved on the encrypted drive. As I read the unredacted clinical reports, the true nature of Cameron's sudden, tragic illness hit me with a sickening, horrifying clarity. The silver-haired doctor at Oakwood Memorial Hospital had not lied. Cameron was actually in stage 4 renal failure. His kidneys were legitimately shutting down. But the timeline they presented to the family was a complete and total fabrication. According to these hidden medical files, Cameron had known about his declining kidney function for nearly 2 years. It was a slow, highly manageable decline. He had been receiving quiet, private treatments to keep it entirely under control without anyone knowing. But exactly 4 months ago, something else happened. I cross-referenced the dates of the massive medical payments with his corporate emails. Exactly 4 months ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission sent a preliminary confidential subpoena to Apex Innovations. Federal financial regulators had finally noticed the massive, glaring discrepancies in his revenue reports. They were officially preparing to audit his entire company. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind with terrifying precision. Cameron was terrified. If the federal government audited his books, they would instantly uncover the Ponzi scheme, and he would go to federal prison for decades. He needed a massive, undeniable distraction. He needed a sympathetic excuse to halt the legal proceedings, freeze the impending audit, and keep his panicked investors from demanding their money back. So he intentionally stopped taking his medication. He purposely allowed his own kidney condition to rapidly and aggressively deteriorate. He weaponized his own failing body to play the ultimate victim card. He wanted to look like a tragic, dying young entrepreneur, so the federal courts would grant him indefinite medical delays. And when his condition became severe enough to require an immediate transplant to survive his own manufactured crisis, my mother and Jessica demanded my organs to save him. The realization made me want to vomit right there on the concrete floor. They did not just want my kidney to cure a sick man. They wanted to rip open my body and harvest my organs simply to buy Cameron more time to hide his stolen millions from the federal government. My health, my future, and my physical body were considered acceptable collateral damage in their desperate attempt to stall a federal criminal indictment. Jessica had the absolute audacity to sue me for $5 million for emotional distress, completely aware that her husband was a corporate criminal hiding behind a hospital gown. My mother had slapped me and disowned me. They had painted me as a monster to their entire wealthy megachurch congregation, destroying my career and my engagement, all to maintain a pathetic, fragile lie. My first instinct was to call the authorities immediately. I wanted to hand over the hard drive, watch the federal agents kick down the doors of that luxury hospital suite, and drag my brother out into the street in handcuffs. I wanted to see the look on my mother's face when she realized her golden child was a complete fraud who had manipulated her. But my training as an auditor forced me to stop, breathe, and calculate the immense risk. If I went to the federal authorities right now, the entire family estate would be frozen in a massive criminal investigation. The government would seize every single asset tied to the family name to pay back the defrauded investors. That legally included the $60 million in bearer bonds and offshore trusts that my father had explicitly left to me in that floor safe. Cameron had already stolen my past. I absolutely refused to let his desperate crimes steal the massive future my father had guaranteed me. I needed to secure the money before the entire fake empire burned to the ground. I closed the laptop, locked the hard drive back in the safe, and began the most meticulous, high-stakes accounting job of my entire professional life. I did not leave the freezing storage unit for 5 continuous days. I survived on stale protein bars and cold water from the rusted spigot outside. I used my deep, specialized knowledge of international tax law and corporate shielding to establish a series of ironclad, impenetrable blind trusts. I registered the entities under bulletproof legal aliases, routing them through independent legal firms in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands that completely insulated the true owner from any domestic litigation. It was a completely legal financial fortress designed specifically to protect massive assets from civil judgments and federal asset forfeiture. Once the legal architecture was perfectly in place, I began moving the wealth. I carefully transferred the physical bearer bonds through a highly secure private brokerage contact I had maintained from my early days in the financial sector. I liquidated the paper bonds into untraceable digital funds, sweeping them directly into my new offshore accounts. I systematically drained every single hidden account my father had listed in the black leather ledger. Millions of dollars flowed seamlessly through the encrypted digital pipelines, moving far away from the toxic, collapsing reach of Cameron's fraudulent tech company. I worked with absolute silent precision. Every transaction was buried under thick layers of legal protection and encrypted security. Within a week and a half, the $60 million was entirely, irrevocably mine. It was locked safely behind a financial wall that neither Cameron nor Jessica nor the federal government could ever breach. My father had built a massive fortune in the shadows, and I had just fortified it for the rest of my life. I sat on the cold concrete floor staring at my final bank statement on the glowing laptop screen. The sheer size of the number staring back at me was almost impossible to comprehend. I was no longer the broke, unemployed outcast freezing in a condemned storage facility. I currently possessed more wealth and true power than Cameron had ever held in his entire miserable life. His $40 million tech company was a hollow shell composed entirely of toxic debt and stolen funds. My $60 million was pure, unencumbered reality. I closed the laptop and placed it safely back into the biometric floor safe. I knew exactly what I had to do next. It was not enough to simply walk away a rich man and leave them to their fate. Cameron and Jessica had gone out of their way to maliciously destroy my reputation. They had weaponized their church community against me. They had convinced the woman I loved to abandon me. They had filed a frivolous, malicious lawsuit designed to ruin me forever. If I simply disappeared with the money, they would continue playing the tragic victims. Cameron would find another way to stall the federal courts, and my mother would spend the rest of her life telling the world that her ungrateful, selfish son had left his brother to die. They needed to be exposed. The entire community needed to see exactly who they were worshiping and defending. But I was not going to strike the first blow. I was going to let them come to me. I knew they were getting incredibly desperate. Cameron's medical condition was worsening by the day, and his wealthy investors were growing restless and suspicious. He needed to lock down my kidney immediately, or his entire carefully constructed facade would collapse in real time. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was starving, broken, and ready to surrender to their demands. I decided to let them keep believing that for just a little while longer. I would let them bring their arrogance right to my front door. And when they did, I would calmly hand them the detonator to their own complete destruction. I was just closing the lid of my laptop when I heard the sound of heavy tires crushing the gravel outside Unit 47. For the last 2 weeks, the only sound in this desolate scrapyard had been the freezing wind rattling the corrugated metal doors. But now there was a loud, chaotic commotion echoing down the narrow alleyway. I heard multiple car doors slamming shut. I heard the sharp, authoritative voice of my mother echoing against the concrete walls. I heard the unmistakable hum of a diesel engine from a heavy-duty commercial vehicle. I quickly locked my laptop back inside the biometric floor safe. I pulled the heavy rubber mat over the steel panel and kicked a few empty cardboard boxes over the hidden vault to conceal it. I stood up, dusted off my worn trousers, and walked toward the sliding metal door. I hauled it upward. The blinding glare of professional television lighting hit me right in the face. I had to shield my eyes against the sudden, overwhelming brightness. When my vision finally adjusted, I could not believe the sheer, calculated spectacle standing right in my front yard. My mother Judith was standing at the very front of the mob. She was wearing a somber, perfectly tailored black wool coat, delicately dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Right beside her was my sister-in-law Jessica, holding the handles of a premium medical-grade wheelchair. Sitting in that wheelchair was my brother Cameron. He was wearing a nasal cannula and had a thick wool blanket draped over his lap. He looked pale, weak, and absolutely pitiful. It was a masterful Academy Award-winning performance, but they had not come alone. Standing behind them were at least a dozen prominent members of Grace Fellowship, the wealthy suburban megachurch that Cameron and Jessica essentially bankrolled. I recognized several of them instantly. There were real estate developers, local politicians, and wealthy dentists. These were the exact same people who had invested millions of dollars into Cameron's fake software company. They were holding large, professionally printed signs with Bible verses about sacrifice and brotherly love. And parked directly behind the crowd with a massive satellite dish extended toward the gray winter sky was a local news van. A reporter with a microphone and a cameraman carrying a heavy shoulder rig were pushing their way to the front of the group. They had brought a literal television crew to my rotting, freezing storage unit. They were completely unaware that the most powerful moves are the ones nobody sees coming. They thought they were bringing a wrecking ball to my life. They did not know I had just spent 2 weeks building an impenetrable financial fortress. The reporter shoved the microphone toward my face. Harrison, the reporter, said, using a tone of deep manufactured sympathy. We are here with your family and your church community. Your brother is in end-stage renal failure. The doctors say you are a perfect match, but you have refused to even take a blood test. Can you explain to our viewers why you are turning your back on your own flesh and blood during his final hours? Before I could even answer, my mother pushed her way past the reporter. She threw herself toward me, stopping just inches from my chest. The cameras pivoted instantly to catch her tear-stained face. Please, Harrison, Judith cried out, her voice cracking with perfectly timed emotion. I am begging you as your mother. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Put aside this petty jealousy. Put aside whatever silly resentments you are holding on to from the past. Your brother is dying. We love you. We just want our family to be whole again. Do not let him leave this earth just because you are angry about money. The church members behind her murmured in collective agreement. A few of the women started openly crying. Jessica stepped forward, resting a protective hand on Cameron's shoulder, looking directly into the camera lens. We have prayed for you every single day. Harrison, Jessica said, her voice dripping with artificial grace. We forgive you for all the terrible things you have said to us. We forgive you for walking out of the hospital. We know you are lost right now, but God gives us chances to redeem ourselves. You can be a hero today. You can save a father, a husband, and a pillar of this community. All you have to do is say yes. I stood there in the freezing cold, looking at this magnificent twisted circus. To the outside world, to the thousands of people who would watch this on the evening news, I looked like an absolute monster. I was the bitter homeless man living in a storage container who refused to save his brilliant charitable brother. But I knew the truth. I knew exactly why they had brought the cameras. Cameron was not trying to win my sympathy. He was trying to buy time. He knew the Securities and Exchange Commission was circling his fraudulent tech company. He knew the federal auditors were preparing their subpoenas. He needed this video broadcasted on every local channel. He needed his wealthy church investors to see him looking fragile and dying in a wheelchair. He needed a public excuse to delay the federal investigations and stop his investors from pulling their money out of his Ponzi scheme. He was using my refusal as the ultimate shield for his criminal empire. Harrison, the reporter, pressed, pushing the microphone closer to my mouth. What do you have to say to your mother? Will you save your brother today? The entire crowd fell completely silent. The only sound was the harsh winter wind whipping against the metal buildings. Everyone was waiting for me to break. They expected me to lower my head in shame. They expected the crushing weight of public humiliation to finally snap my spirit. Instead, I stood perfectly straight. I looked directly into the camera lens, my face calm and completely devoid of emotion. No, I said loudly, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. I will not be tested, and I will not be donating any part of my body. A loud collective gasp rippled through the church members. My mother let out a dramatic theatrical sob and buried her face in her hands. Jessica shook her head in sheer disgust. How can you be so incredibly heartless? Jessica yelled, pointing a manicured finger at me. You are a disgusting excuse for a human being. You are going to let him die. I did not respond to her. I did not look at my mother. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Cameron. He was sitting in his wheelchair looking up at me with a mixture of anger and smug satisfaction. He thought he had just won. He thought my public refusal had just given him the perfect tragic alibi he desperately needed for the federal courts. I stepped forward, moving slowly and deliberately toward the wheelchair. The crowd parted slightly, giving me room. The cameraman stepped in closer, clearly expecting me to yell or throw a punch. They wanted a chaotic, violent confrontation for their evening broadcast, but I did not yell. I walked right up to my brother. I knelt down on one knee on the freezing, cracked asphalt so I was perfectly level with his face. I reached out and gently placed my hand on his shoulder, mirroring the exact fake compassion his wife had just displayed. To the reporter, to the church members, and to the camera, it looked like a profound emotional moment between two estranged brothers. It looked like I was leaning in to offer a final apology or a tearful goodbye. I leaned my head forward until my mouth was less than an inch away from his right ear. I did not speak about kidneys. I did not speak about our mother or the past. I kept my voice at a barely audible, razor-sharp whisper. Cayman National Bank. I whispered directly into his ear. Account routing number 800421977. The corporate shell name is Apex Holdings International. The current toxic debt load is exactly $40.6 million. I felt Cameron's entire body go completely rigid beneath my hand. It was as if someone had just injected pure ice water directly into his veins. I moved my mouth slightly closer, ensuring only he could hear my next words. You used my $80,000 college fund to start the fraud 12 years ago. But do not worry, Cameron. The $60 million you were hiding in the floor, safe right behind me, is completely secure. It is in my name now. Every single penny. I hold the ledgers. I hold the encrypted drive. I hold the detonator to your entire pathetic life. I slowly pulled my head back and looked him dead in the eyes. The physical transformation in my brother was absolutely terrifying. The fake manufactured weakness he was performing for the cameras completely vanished. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His eyes were blown wide open in sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man who had just watched his own executioner pull the lever. He was staring at a ghost. He was staring at the sudden, catastrophic end of his freedom. I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off my knee. I gave him a small, polite smile, acting perfectly civil for the surrounding cameras. I hope you find the peace you are looking for, brother, I said loudly. Cameron started hyperventilating. His chest heaved violently. This was not a performance anymore. He reached up with trembling hands and ripped the nasal cannula off his face. Turn the cameras off! Cameron screamed. His voice was shrill, desperate, and completely frantic. Turn the cameras off right now! Get them out of here! The reporter looked utterly baffled. He lowered his microphone, staring at Cameron in shock. Sir, we are just trying to tell your story, the reporter stammered. I said, turn the damn cameras off! Cameron roared, his voice cracking with pure panic. He grabbed the wheels of his chair, struggling to spin himself around. Jessica, get me out of here! We need to leave! We need to leave right now! Jessica stared at him, her mouth hanging open. Cameron. What is wrong with you? She asked. The news crew is still filming. We need this coverage. Do not argue with me, Cameron shrieked, his eyes darting wildly between the camera and my face. Get me in the car. We have to call the lawyers. We have to call the bank. Get me out of this scrapyard right now. The entire crowd of church members stood frozen in absolute confusion. My mother stepped forward, reaching out for him. Cameron, sweetheart, please calm down, Judith pleaded. Your heart cannot take this stress. What did he say to you? What did Harrison say to you? Cameron completely ignored her. He shoved his wife's hands away from the wheelchair handles and tried to push himself toward the luxury sport utility vehicle, nearly tipping the chair over in his absolute desperation to escape. Jessica finally realized he was entirely serious. She grabbed the handles, her face flushed with extreme embarrassment, and began pushing him rapidly toward the Range Rover. The local news cameraman kept rolling, capturing the bizarre, chaotic retreat of the man who had just played the dying martyr only 60 seconds ago. The church members lowered their signs, exchanging nervous, uncomfortable whispers. The grand, orchestrated public shaming had instantly turned into a frantic, unexplainable panic attack. My mother stood alone in the middle of the cracked asphalt, looking between the retreating luxury vehicle and me. She looked entirely lost. The narrative she had so carefully constructed was falling apart right in front of her eyes. "Harrison," she said, her voice wavering. "What is happening? What did you just do?" I looked at the woman who had slapped me and called me nothing just a few weeks ago. I did not feel any anger toward her anymore. I just felt a deep, profound pity. She was defending a criminal who had stolen from his own family, and she was about to lose absolutely everything because of it. "You should probably go with him, Mom," I said calmly. "He is going to need a lot of support in the coming weeks. The truth is going to be very hard for all of you." I turned around, walked back into my freezing storage unit, and grabbed the heavy sliding door. I looked out at the bewildered crowd one last time. The reporter was standing awkwardly by the news van. The church members were slowly walking back to their cars. Cameron was being shoved into the back seat of the Range Rover, screaming at his wife to drive faster. I pulled the heavy corrugated metal door down. The loud metallic crash echoed through the empty scrapyard, sealing me back inside my concrete fortress. The cold air wrapped around me, but my chest felt incredibly warm. They had brought the entire world to my doorstep to destroy me. Instead, they had just realized that they were standing on ground that was about to completely crumble beneath their feet. I walked over to the center of the room, standing directly over the hidden vault. I had secured the money. I had secured the evidence. I had delivered the warning. The trap was set. All I had to do now was sit in the dark and wait for the federal government to notice the massive gaping hole in Cameron's fraudulent empire. I sat in the absolute silence of my frozen storage unit and watched the digital traps I had set spring to life. For a forensic accountant, a computer screen is not just a collection of numbers. It is a window into human behavior. I did not need to be in the same room as my brother to know exactly what he was doing. I could see his sheer, unadulterated panic reflecting in the real-time banking alerts flashing across my monitor. The moment Cameron left the scrapyard, his entire strategy changed. He had spent months carefully crafting the image of a tragic, dying young entrepreneur. He had starved himself, manipulated his medical charts, and staged elaborate, heartbreaking scenes for his wealthy church congregation. He needed them to believe he was too sick to face a federal audit. But the whisper I delivered into his ear destroyed that illusion instantly. Cameron realized that playing the victim would not save him from a $60 million embezzlement charge. Self-preservation violently overrode his medical facade. According to the digital footprint I was tracking, Cameron did not even return to his luxury suite at Oakwood Memorial Hospital. He completely abandoned his incredibly expensive medical care. He did not wait for a doctor to discharge him. He ripped the intravenous lines out of his own arms, walked out of the hospital lobby, and immediately began contacting his offshore brokers. I sat in the dark and watched the frantic, chaotic movement of a man trying to flee the country. Cameron logged into the primary corporate account for Apex Innovations. He bypassed the board of directors completely and attempted to initiate a massive, catastrophic wire transfer. He tried to liquidate $15 million of the remaining investor capital and funnel it directly into a private holding account in a non-extradition territory. It was the absolute worst move he could have possibly made. When you run a highly illegal Ponzi scheme, your survival depends on complete financial stability and quiet, predictable transactions. The moment you attempt to move 8 figures of stolen money across international borders without proper documentation, you trigger every single automated safeguard in the federal banking system. Cameron was acting out of pure, blinding fear. He thought he could grab whatever cash was left and disappear before I handed the master ledgers to the authorities. He had no idea that the Securities and Exchange Commission already had a microscopic tracking algorithm attached to his shell companies. His massive wire transfer did not go through. Instead, it tripped a massive red flag at the federal level. I leaned back on my plastic crate, watching the transfer status on my screen change from pending to a bright, flashing red notice that read, "Frozen by federal mandate." The trap had officially snapped shut. Cameron had just handed the federal government the exact probable cause they needed to bypass the standard audit and move directly to a criminal raid. While his digital world was catching fire, Cameron and Jessica were desperately trying to maintain their physical illusion. That same evening, Jessica was hosting a massive, incredibly lavish charity dinner at their sprawling suburban mansion. It was billed as a prayer vigil and medical fundraiser for Cameron. The sheer hypocrisy of the event was entirely staggering. Jessica had hired a professional catering company, a string quartet, and a high-end event photographer. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles belonging to the elite members of Grace Fellowship, the very same people Cameron had been actively robbing for a decade. I tracked the events of that night through the live social media updates the church members were proudly posting. I watched video clips of my mother Judith wearing a $10,000 evening gown, weeping gracefully in the center of the grand foyer. She accepted hugs and envelopes of cash from politicians and real estate developers, thanking them for supporting her golden child during his darkest hour. Cameron was in the background of these videos. He was sweating profusely, pacing nervously near the marble staircase. He was still wearing his hospital wristband for dramatic effect, but his eyes were glued to his mobile phone. He was frantically hitting refresh on his banking application, waiting for a $15 million transfer that was never going to arrive. He was surrounded by millions of dollars of imported flowers and crystal chandeliers, but he looked like a cornered animal. They were celebrating their status, completely oblivious to the fact that sometimes the people laughing at you are standing on ground that's about to crumble beneath their feet. At exactly 8:30 in the evening, the elaborate illusion was violently shattered. The social media feeds I was monitoring suddenly dissolved into absolute chaos. The live videos stopped showing smiling pastors and weeping relatives. Instead, the shaky, panicked footage showed a fleet of unmarked black sport utility vehicles violently swerving onto the manicured lawn of the mansion. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI and SEC printed boldly in bright yellow stormed the front doors. They did not knock. They used a heavy tactical ram to smash the custom mahogany doors completely off their hinges. The sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed over the gentle music of the string quartet. The wealthy church members screamed in absolute terror, dropping their champagne flutes on the imported rugs. Federal agents flooded the grand foyer, shouting aggressive commands, ordering the elite politicians and corporate executives to drop their phones and step away from the center of the room. I watched a shaky video stream recorded by a terrified guest hiding behind a floral arrangement. I saw Cameron freeze in the middle of his grand staircase. He did not look like a confident, brilliant chief executive officer anymore. He dropped his mobile phone, raised his trembling hands into the air, and let out a pathetic, high-pitched sob. Two federal agents sprinted up the stairs, grabbed my brother by his expensive tailored jacket, and slammed him aggressively against the marble banister. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed perfectly through the silent, horrified crowd. Cameron Thorne, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, massive embezzlement, and the operation of an illegal financial enterprise. The lead agent shouted, his voice booming across the lavish dining room. My mother let out a hysterical, blood-curdling scream. She lunged forward, trying to grab the federal agent by the arm. "You cannot do this!" Judith shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "He is a sick man. He is dying. He is a pillar of this community. You have the wrong person." The lead agent did not even look at her. He simply raised his voice so the entire congregation of wealthy investors could hear him loud and clear. "Ma'am, your son is not a pillar of anything. His medical records have been heavily falsified to delay a federal subpoena. His tech company does not exist. He is currently harboring $40 million in toxic corporate debt, and he has stolen from nearly every single person standing in this room." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and completely catastrophic. The pity and the prayers vanished in a single heartbeat. The elite church members, the people who had just handed Judith envelopes of cash, suddenly realized they had been funding a massive criminal syndicate. Shouts of sheer outrage erupted. Men in expensive tuxedos began screaming at Cameron, demanding their life savings back. Women who had been hugging my mother just 5 minutes earlier backed away from her in absolute disgust. Cameron was dragged down the marble staircase, crying hysterically, his designer shoes scraping uselessly against the floor. They marched him out the shattered front doors, pushing him directly into the back of a federal vehicle, while the local news crews, who had been tipped off by the massive police presence, filmed the entire humiliating spectacle. But the destruction of my brother was only the very first domino to fall. The real betrayal came from inside the house. While Cameron was being shoved into a federal transport, Jessica did not run outside to defend her husband. She did not beg the agents for mercy or call a high-powered defense attorney. She showed her true, absolutely ruthless colors. The moment she heard the words, "federal wire fraud," Jessica realized her lavish country club lifestyle was entirely over. She knew the government would seize the mansion, the cars, and the jewelry. She slipped away from the chaotic crowd in the foyer, ran up the back staircase, and locked herself inside her massive walk-in closet. She opened her personal laptop and logged into the joint banking portals she shared with Cameron. She tried to rapidly transfer whatever domestic funds were left into a private hidden account, registered under her maiden name. She was fully prepared to drain the last remaining dollars, pack a single bag of expensive clothes, and leave her husband to rot in a federal penitentiary. She hit the transfer button. The screen immediately locked. A bright, glaring notification popped up bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The message stated that all assets, properties, and liquid funds tied to the Thorne family were officially frozen, pending a massive federal racketeering investigation. Jessica stared at the screen, her breathing shallow and ragged. She tried another account. Frozen. She tried a high-limit credit card. Declined. She tried the offshore routing numbers Cameron had given her. They were completely empty, already drained by me days ago. She was left with absolutely nothing. The multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio, the endless shopping sprees, the immense social power she wielded at the church, it was all instantly vaporized. She was standing in a closet full of clothes she could no longer legally own, married to a man facing decades in a federal cell. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, screaming in pure, helpless frustration. And then the shockwave of ruin finally reached my mother. Judith had built her entire identity on being the matriarch of a wealthy, successful family. She looked down on anyone who did not meet her impossible financial standards, especially her own youngest son. She had gladly sacrificed my college education, my career, and my dignity just to keep Cameron perched on his fake pedestal. As the federal agents began taping massive, bright red seizure notices to the front doors of the mansion, Judith's mobile phone began to ring incessantly. The news of the $40 million Ponzi scheme had hit the local media networks with terrifying speed. The first phone call was from the president of her exclusive, highly prestigious country club. He did not offer any condolences. He curtly informed her that due to the extreme severity of the criminal charges, her membership was permanently revoked, effective immediately. He ordered her to have her locker cleared out by morning, or her belongings would be thrown into the garbage. The second phone call was from the senior pastor of Grace Fellowship. He spoke in a cold, distant tone, explaining that the church board had held an emergency meeting. Since Cameron had directly defrauded dozens of their most prominent members, Judith and Jessica were no longer welcome on the church grounds. They were officially excommunicated from the very social circle they had used to destroy my life just weeks prior. But the third phone call was the one that finally broke her completely. It was an executive from the primary regional bank. Over the past 5 years, as Cameron's fraudulent company began bleeding cash, he had desperately needed new lines of credit to keep the illusion afloat. He had gone to Judith, playing the role of the stressed but brilliant innovator. And Judith, blinded by her absolute adoration for her golden child, had happily signed the paperwork. She had used her own sprawling, paid-off suburban home as the ultimate collateral for his massive business loans. She had co-signed the debt. The bank executive informed her that because the company was a proven criminal enterprise, the standard grace periods for loan repayment were entirely null and void. The bank was calling in the debt immediately. Since Cameron's assets were frozen by the federal government, the bank was initiating an emergency fast-tracked foreclosure on Judith's home. She had less than a week to vacate the premises. Judith dropped her phone onto the driveway. She stood in the freezing rain watching the federal agents load boxes of evidence computers and files out of Cameron's house. She had no country club to run to. She had no church community to shelter her. She had no home to return to. In the span of a single evening, her entire universe had been violently and permanently dismantled. I closed my laptop and set it carefully on the concrete floor of my dark storage unit. The brutal, unyielding cold of the metal room did not bother me at all. I leaned my head back against the rusted wall and took a long, deep breath. 12 years ago, they stole my future and laughed in my face. Just a few weeks ago, they demanded my physical organs destroyed, my career, chased away my fiancée, and tried to banish me to the slums. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were the masters of the universe. They never realized that by pushing me into the dark, they had simply given me the perfect place to sit quietly and pull the single crucial thread that unraveled their entire world. I stood on the cracked, weed-choked asphalt of the storage facility and watched a massive yellow bulldozer tear straight through the corrugated metal roof of Unit 47. The loud, tearing crunch of rusted steel echoing across the empty industrial lot was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The freezing winter was finally beginning to thaw into an early spring, and the bitter cold that had nearly killed me just a few months prior was gone entirely. I was wearing a custom-tailored wool coat, holding a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints and watching the physical manifestation of my absolute rock bottom being crushed into scrap metal. With the $60 million legally and permanently secured in blind offshore trusts, I had immediately gone to work. I did not buy a fleet of exotic sports cars or charter private jets to Europe. I did not care about the flashy, superficial illusion of wealth that had ultimately destroyed my brother. I cared about legacy. I cared about building something real, something that could never be seized, repossessed, or exposed as a fraud. My father had strategically purchased this massive plot of industrial land decades ago, because he knew the city zoning laws were eventually going to change. He knew the desolate outskirts of town were slated for a massive commercial revival. The rotting storage units were just a placeholder, a brilliant disguise to keep the property taxes low until the right moment arrived. I was finally executing his master plan. I hired the top commercial contracting firm in the state. I paid them a premium in pure cash to fast-track the demolition and secure the new building permits. Within weeks, the sprawling nightmare of rusted buildings and collapsed roofs was entirely leveled, replaced by a massive, meticulously graded dirt foundation. In its place, I was breaking ground on a state-of-the-art commercial plaza. The blueprints in my hand detailed premium retail spaces, modern corporate offices, and a beautifully landscaped outdoor dining courtyard. But the crown jewel of the development was the anchor building at the very center of the lot. I was using a significant portion of my own capital to build a massive, fully funded community youth center. It was going to feature an indoor basketball court, a digital literacy lab, and free after-school mentoring programs for the local neighborhood. It was my direct response to the wealthy, hypocritical megachurch that had so eagerly participated in my destruction. While they hoarded their wealth and judged people from their padded pews, I was going to use my money to actually build people up. My personal life underwent an equally dramatic transformation. For years I had scraped by in cramped, noisy apartments, constantly worried about the next rent increase. The day after the federal government raided Cameron's mansion, I drove to a quiet, heavily wooded suburb on the opposite side of the city. I found a beautiful, sprawling, mid-century modern home sitting on 2 acres of private land. It was not a gaudy, oversized McMansion built to impress country club socialites. It was elegant, solidly built, and surrounded by ancient oak trees. I walked through the hardwood hallways looking at the stone fireplace, and the massive windows overlooking the private garden. When the real estate agent handed me the closing paperwork, she asked if I had secured my mortgage pre-approval. I simply reached into my briefcase, pulled out my checkbook, and handed her a cashier's check for the entire purchase price. The feeling of owning the roof over my head outright without a single cent of debt to any bank or any family member was a level of freedom I had never known existed. As the construction on the commercial plaza rapidly progressed, my sudden rise from a fired, disgraced corporate auditor to a massive commercial developer did not go unnoticed. The local media had been in an absolute frenzy ever since Cameron was indicted for his $40 million Ponzi scheme. The press had documented the spectacular, humiliating collapse of the golden child. But then the public record showed that his outcast younger brother had just purchased the most highly coveted commercial real estate project in the county using entirely legitimate debt-free capital. The premier business magazine in the city reached out to my office for an exclusive interview. I agreed, knowing exactly what I was doing. When the monthly issue hit the newsstands, my face was right on the glossy front cover. I was standing in front of the steel framing of the new community center, wearing a sharp navy suit. The headline read, "From the ashes of a family scandal, Harrison Thorne builds a real empire." The article detailed my massive cash investment into the city, praised my transparent business practices, and highlighted the absolute reality of my wealth compared to the hollow criminal illusion my brother had built. I knew the magazine would find its way into the hands of the people who had abandoned me. I knew it would sit on the polished coffee tables of the country club executives who had fired me. I knew it would echo through the gossip circles of Grace Fellowship. I wanted them all to see it. I wanted them to know that while they were busy, desperately scrambling to distance themselves from a federal criminal, the man they had thrown into the dirt had quietly bought the entire block. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the ghost of my ruined past finally came crawling back. I was sitting behind the massive walnut desk in my newly leased temporary corporate office downtown. I was reviewing the plumbing contracts for the commercial plaza when the intercom on my desk phone buzzed. My new administrative assistant sounded hesitant. She told me there was a woman in the lobby insisting she had a personal appointment with me. She said her name was Sarah. I stopped typing on my keyboard. The silence in my office suddenly felt very heavy. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling my heart steady itself into a slow, calculated rhythm. "Send her in," I said. The heavy glass door to my office slowly pushed open. Sarah stepped inside, clutching her expensive leather handbag with both hands. She looked entirely different from the frantic, screaming woman who had thrown her engagement ring onto a glass coffee table just a few months ago. She was wearing a stunning, tailored beige dress. Her hair was perfectly blown out. She looked soft, apologetic, and incredibly nervous. She stood frozen by the door, her eyes scanning the panoramic view of the city skyline behind my desk, taking in the sheer undeniable reality of my new corporate power. "Harrison," she said, her voice barely above a delicate whisper, "you look incredible." I did not stand up. I did not offer her a chair. I simply leaned back in my leather executive chair and folded my hands together on the desk. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. She took a few tentative steps forward, letting a perfectly timed tear well up in her eye. She was playing the role of the tragic, manipulated victim with the exact same theatrical skill my mother used to deploy. "I came here to apologize," she said, her voice trembling softly. "I saw the magazine cover yesterday. I read the article about what Cameron did. I read about the fraud and the stolen money. Harrison, I had absolutely no idea. I was completely blind to it." She walked up to the edge of my desk, pressing her hand over her heart. I was so scared back then, she pleaded. "Your mother and Jessica called me constantly. They told me you were having a mental breakdown. They told me you were intentionally trying to murder your brother out of spite. The people at the church cornered me in the parking lot. My own boss threatened my job because of the scandal. I was surrounded by lies, Harrison. They brainwashed me into believing you were a monster. I sat there watching her perform. 12 years of auditing had taught me to read people just as easily as I read a balance sheet. I did not look at her tears. I looked at the cold, calculating panic hiding just beneath the surface of her eyes. She was terrified that she had thrown away a winning lottery ticket. I was weak, she continued, letting the tear fall gracefully down her cheek. I panicked under the pressure, and I made the biggest mistake of my entire life. But I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. When I saw that magazine cover, when I saw that you had survived all of this and come out stronger, my heart just broke. I want to make it right. I want to support you. We can put all this ugliness behind us and be the team we were always supposed to be. She reached her hand across the polished walnut desk, her fingers trembling, waiting for me to take it. Waiting for me to be the weak, forgiving man who used to bend over backward just to keep the peace. I looked at her hand. I did not move a single muscle. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and precise. "Do you remember the exact words you said to me on the day you packed your bags?" She pulled her hand back slightly, her expression faltering. "Harrison, I was upset. I did not mean. You said I was a cold, broken person." I interrupted, stating the fact clearly. "You said you refused to spend your life walking into rooms where people whispered behind your back because your husband was a hated outcast. You said you could not be with a monster. I was manipulated by Jessica," she cried out, her voice rising in defensive panic. "She lied to me about the kidney." "No, she did not," I fired back, my voice finally hardening with authority. Jessica did not lie about the kidney. Cameron really was in stage 4 renal failure. I really did refuse to give him my organs. That part was entirely true. You knew I was refusing the surgery because they had stolen my college fund and emotionally abused me for a decade. I sat in our kitchen and told you the absolute truth about my family. You knew all the facts. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off immediately. "You did not leave me because you thought I was a monster, Sarah. You left me because my bank account hit $42. She physically flinched, stepping back from the desk as if I had struck her. "You left because I got fired." I continued, mercilessly dissecting her entire narrative. "You left because the country club members stopped waving at you. You left because the illusion of your comfortable upper-middle-class social status was threatened. You dropped that diamond ring on the glass table and walked out the door because you looked at me and calculated that my net worth had just dropped to 0. You did an audit on my life, and you decided I was a bad investment." "Harrison, please," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "That is not true. I love you." "If it were true," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk, "you would have come looking for me months ago. When I was sleeping on a freezing concrete floor inside a rusted storage unit eating stale protein bars just to survive, you did not call. When I had absolutely nothing, you were nowhere to be found. You did not come here today because you realized my family manipulated you. You came here today because you saw me wearing a bespoke suit on the cover of a business magazine. You came here because you realized the man you dumped is now worth $60 million and you want your seat back on the private jet." Sarah dropped her hands. The soft, apologetic tears vanished instantly. Her face hardened into a mask of bitter, ugly resentment. The absolute truth had cornered her, and she hated me for forcing her to look at it. "You really have turned into a cold person," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You are going to end up completely alone with all that money." I smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed smile. I would much rather be alone than sit across the dinner table from someone who only loves my bank account, I replied. I reached out and pressed the intercom button on my desk phone. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," my assistant answered immediately. "Could you please send security up to my office?" I said calmly. "My guest was just leaving and I want to make sure she finds her way to the elevator safely." "Understood, sir. Right away." Sarah stared at me in sheer disbelief. Her chest heaved with indignation. She grabbed her expensive leather handbag, turned sharply on her heels, and marched toward the door. She yanked the heavy glass open, but before she stepped out into the hallway, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "You are making a massive mistake, Harrison." I picked up my pen and pulled a commercial plumbing contract toward the center of my desk. "The only mistake I ever made was buying you that ring," I said without even looking up. "Close the door on your way out." I heard the sharp click of her heels storm down the corridor, followed by the heavy thud of the glass door sealing shut. The corporate office fell perfectly silent once again. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling an immense, heavy burden completely lift off my shoulders. The last remaining ghost of my old pathetic life had just been permanently exorcised. They had all severely underestimated my intelligence, but more importantly, they had vastly underestimated my self-respect. I was no longer the desperate, accommodating younger brother trying to buy their affection. I was the master of my own reality. And as I sat in the quiet luxury of my new empire, I knew the final, most satisfying chapter of my revenge was still waiting to walk through my front doors. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate suite, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished walnut desk. The commercial plaza was rising rapidly from the dirt outside, a massive structure of steel and glass replacing the rusted ruins of the storage facility where I had once frozen in the dark. My life had settled into a quiet, powerful rhythm. The frantic chaos of my past felt like it belonged to a completely different person. Then the intercom on my desk buzzed. My assistant sounded incredibly uncomfortable. She told me there was a situation in the lobby. She said my mother and my brother were downstairs. They did not have an appointment. The security guards had tried to turn them away, but my mother was causing a massive scene, crying and refusing to leave the reception area. I did not feel a spike of panic. I did not feel the old familiar anxiety that used to choke me whenever my family demanded my attention. I just felt a cold, calculated calm. I told my assistant to have security escort them up to my office. I walked back to my window and looked down at the street-level entrance. Parked illegally by the curb was a faded, dented sedan that looked at least 15 years old. The bumper was mismatched and the paint was peeling off the hood. It was a staggering contrast to the fleet of luxury vehicles Cameron and Judith used to parade around the city. They had lost the mansions, the sports cars, and the country club memberships. They had been reduced to the absolute bare minimum of survival. A few moments later, the heavy glass doors to my office swung open. 2 large security guards stood just outside in the hallway watching closely as my mother and my brother stepped into the room. The physical transformation of the 2 people standing in front of me was absolutely shocking. Cameron was not wearing a $5,000 tailored suit. He was wearing a standard-issue, faded blue hospital gown paired with cheap gray sweatpants and worn-out slippers. His face was gaunt, his skin a terrifying shade of gray. He was leaning heavily on a cheap aluminum cane just to keep himself upright, and secured tightly around his left ankle, clearly visible above his slipper, was a bulky black GPS tracking monitor. The federal government had clearly deemed him a massive flight risk. My mother, Judith, looked like she had aged 20 years in the span of a single month. The perfectly styled hair and the expensive gold jewelry were completely gone. She was wearing a plain, shapeless sweater. Her eyes were bloodshot and deeply sunken into her face. The arrogant, commanding matriarch who had slapped me across the face in the VIP hospital suite had been entirely erased. They stood just inside the doorway, staring at the sheer scale of my office. They looked at the massive desk, the expensive leather chairs, and the panoramic view of the city. They were finally seeing the undeniable reality of the $60 million empire they had unknowingly handed to me. "Harrison," my mother whispered. Her voice was raspy and weak. I remained standing by the window. I did not invite them to sit down. I did not offer them a glass of water. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Cameron took a slow, agonizing step forward. He leaned heavily on his cane, his breathing shallow and labored. The confident golden child persona was completely dead. He looked exactly like what he was, a broken, terrified criminal facing the absolute end of the road. "Harrison, please listen to me," Cameron gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You have to help me. You are the only person left in the world who can help me. Everyone else is gone." Jessica took whatever cash she had hidden in her personal accounts and left the state. The church completely abandoned us. The feds froze every single bank account I have ever touched. I have absolutely nothing left. I stared at him, my expression entirely blank. "That sounds like the inevitable consequence of running a $40 million Ponzi scheme," I replied calmly. "You stole from your friends. You stole from your congregation. You stole from this family. The federal government is just doing its job." Cameron shook his head frantically, leaning his weight onto the back of one of my leather guest chairs. "You do not understand how bad it is," he pleaded. "The stress of the federal indictment, the panic of the raids. It destroyed me, Harrison. The doctors were trying to manage my kidney failure with medication, but the stress caused my blood pressure to spike. My kidneys have completely shut down. The deterioration accelerated faster than anyone predicted. I am dying. I am actually dying right now." I looked at the hospital gown clinging to his frail frame. I knew he was not lying this time. The boy who had cried wolf to delay a federal audit was finally facing the genuine, terrifying reality of his own mortality. He had played a dangerous game with his health, and he had lost. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about it?" I asked. "I told you weeks ago that I am not giving you my kidney. My answer has not changed." "I am not asking for your kidney," Cameron sobbed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I know you will never give it to me. I know I ruined any chance of that. But I need money, Harrison. I need your money." I crossed my arms over my chest, watching him completely humiliate himself. "Explain it to me," I said. Cameron swallowed hard tears, finally spilling over his pale cheeks. "The federal prosecutors are pushing for a maximum sentence. They want to put me in a federal penitentiary for 30 years. I cannot survive 30 years in a cell. I cannot even survive the next 3 months without a transplant. I need a high-powered defense attorney. I need a legal team that can negotiate a medical plea deal, but the best lawyers demand a $2 million retainer up front. I do not have a single dollar to my name." He took another agonizing step forward, his hands shaking violently. "And the transplant list, Harrison. The National Registry kicked me off the active recipient list because I am a pending federal felon with frozen assets. No hospital in this country will perform a transplant on me now. My only chance is to go overseas. I have contacts who can arrange a private off-the-books transplant in Eastern Europe. They can get me a kidney by next week. But it costs $5 million in pure, untraceable cash." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his request hung in the quiet air of my office. He was standing there wearing a federal ankle monitor, admitting he wanted to flee the country to buy a black market organ, and he was asking me to fund the entire criminal enterprise. "Let me make sure I understand this perfectly," I said, my voice echoing coldly across the room. 12 years ago, you used my $80,000 college fund to start an illegal fraud ring. You spent a decade living in a mansion and driving sports cars while I struggled to pay rent. When your crimes caught up with you, you tried to harvest my organs to buy yourself a legal delay. You instructed your wife to sue me for $5 million to force me onto an operating table. You destroyed my career and my relationship, and now you want me to give you $7 million of my own legally secured money so you can hire a celebrity lawyer and buy a black market body part." Cameron dropped his head, his shoulders shaking as he cried. "I am sorry," he wept. "I am so sorry for everything I did to you. I was arrogant. I was greedy. But I am your brother Harrison. Please, you have $60 million. $7 million is nothing to you now. You can save my life and still be a rich man. You hold the power to fix all of this." Before I could even respond, my mother suddenly pushed past Cameron. She threw herself onto the carpeted floor right in front of my desk. She dropped directly to her knees, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. The sight of Judith, the proud, judgmental woman who had terrorized me my entire life, kneeling on the floor of my office was entirely surreal. "Harrison, Please," Judith screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet office. "Have mercy on us. Have mercy on your family." She crawled forward on her knees, reaching out to grab the hem of my trousers. I took a sharp step back, refusing to let her touch me. "You cannot let him die like this," she sobbed, staring up at me with wild, frantic eyes. "He made mistakes. He made terrible, awful mistakes. I know we treated you badly. I know I was wrong to slap you. I was just so scared of losing my boy, but you are my boy too. You have the money now. Your father left you the real fortune. You won Harrison. You beat us. You won the game. Now please be the bigger person." Her begging quickly shifted into absolute hysteria. She pounded her fists against the carpet, her tears soaking her face. "You have $60 million, she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "You can make the federal charges go away. You can buy him the best doctors in the world. You have enough money to fix everything. If you let him die, his blood is on your hands. You will carry that guilt for the rest of your life. I am your mother, and I am begging you to save my son." I stood absolutely still, looking down at the woman weeping on my floor and the brother leaning against the chair. I remembered the day of my grandfather's funeral, when they had all laughed at me for inheriting nothing but an envelope. I remembered my mother telling me I owed them my life. I remembered the cold concrete floor of the storage unit where they had tried to bury me. They were not sorry for the abuse. They were not sorry for the theft. They were only sorry that they had lost their power, and they were terrified because they realized I now held absolute control over their survival. They thought they could use my basic human decency against me. They thought if they cried hard enough and begged loud enough, I would revert back to the obedient, accommodating son I used to be. They were waiting for my answer. The entire room was completely silent except for the sound of my mother's ragged breathing and the steady mechanical beep of Cameron's ankle monitor. I looked at the two people who had stolen my past, and I prepared to deliver the final absolute verdict on their future. I looked down at my mother. She was kneeling on the imported carpet of my office, a woman who had spent her entire life standing on the throats of other people to elevate herself. She was crying hysterically, begging for a fraction of the wealth my father had deliberately kept out of her hands. Beside her, Cameron was leaning on his cheap aluminum cane, looking at me with hollow, desperate eyes. They were waiting for me to be the weak, compliant younger brother they had trained me to be. They were waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and blindly fund their salvation. I leaned forward in my executive chair and rested my hands flat on the polished walnut desk. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. I wanted them to feel the absolute weight of their total vulnerability. "No," I said calmly. The single word hung in the air like a physical weight. My mother stopped crying. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock, as if she could not comprehend the language I was speaking. Cameron gripped the handle of his cane until his knuckles turned completely white. "No," my mother repeated, her voice a fragile whisper. "Harrison, what do you mean, no? I just told you he is going to die. I just told you the federal prosecutors are trying to lock him away for 30 years. You have the money. You can save him. I am not giving you a single dollar to hire a celebrity defense attorney," I told them, keeping my voice incredibly even. "And I am absolutely not giving you $5 million to fly overseas and buy a black market organ from some criminal syndicate in Eastern Europe. I will not fund your legal defense, and I will not fund your escape plan." Cameron let out a sharp, breathless gasp. "You are sentencing me to death," he choked out. "You are killing me, Harrison." "You killed yourself, Cameron," I replied instantly. "You spent the last 10 years stealing from innocent people. You stole from the church members who trusted you. You stole my college fund to build a fake empire. And when the federal government finally caught up with you, you tried to rip out my kidney to buy yourself a few more months of freedom. You chose the illusion of success. Now you pay for the reality." My mother scrambled up from the floor, her previous posture of begging suddenly turning into desperate, flailing anger. "You cannot do this," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You are his brother. You are my son. We are family. Family protects each other. Your father left you that money so you could protect us." I stood up from my chair. I did not yell, but my physical presence in the room suddenly felt massive. "Do not ever speak for my father," I told her, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "My father left me that storage facility because he knew exactly who both of you were. He knew Cameron was a corporate criminal. He knew you were entirely complicit in his arrogant lifestyle. He left the money to me because he knew I was the only person in this family who would not waste it on luxury cars and country club memberships." I walked around the edge of the desk, stepping closer to them. "Where was this speech about family protecting each other 12 years ago?" I asked her. "Where was this profound family loyalty when you and Dad drained my $80,000 trust fund and handed it to Cameron? Where was this fierce maternal love a month ago when I was completely broke, entirely homeless, and sleeping on a freezing concrete floor in a condemned scrapyard?" Judith opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stood there, trembling under the weight of her own hypocrisy. "You did not care if I froze to death?" I continued, absolutely dismantling her entire argument. "You did not care that Jessica sued me for $5 million. You cheered when I lost my job. You were perfectly happy to watch me lose everything as long as your golden child got to keep pretending he was a tech genius. You made your choice, Mom. You chose Cameron. You chose the stolen money. You chose the country club. And now that it is all completely gone, you do not get to come into my office and pretend you care about family. You only care about my bank account." I turned my attention away from her and looked directly at Cameron. He was trembling violently, sweating through his faded hospital gown. The monitor on his ankle beeped quietly, a constant reminder that he was property of the federal government. He was entirely trapped. "I am not going to fund your criminal escape, Cameron," I told him. "But I am not a monster. I will not let you die from kidney failure." Cameron looked up, a tiny, pathetic glimmer of hope suddenly flashing in his sunken eyes. "You will help me," he whispered. "I will offer you a deal," I said, walking back around my desk and sitting down. "It is a one-time, non-negotiable offer. I will contact the best private medical facility in the state. I will use my money to pay for top-tier state-of-the-art dialysis treatments. I will ensure you receive the highest level of legal medical care available in this country. It will not cure you, but it will keep you alive. I will pay the massive medical bills directly to the hospital, so you do not die waiting for a legal transplant." Cameron let out a massive sigh of relief. He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he sobbed. "Oh my God. Thank you, Harrison." I held up my hand, stopping his celebration instantly. "Do not thank me yet," I warned him. "I said I was offering you a deal, and the cost of my financial support is absolute truth." Cameron froze. His eyes darted around the room nervously. "What do you mean?" he asked. I opened the top drawer of my walnut desk. I pulled out a thick stack of legal paper and a heavy fountain pen. I slid them across the polished wood, pushing them toward the empty chair sitting directly across from me. "I will pay to keep you alive," I told him, pointing at the paper. "But only if you sit down in that chair right now and write a full, comprehensive, legally binding confession for the Securities and Exchange Commission." Cameron stared at the blank paper as if it were a loaded weapon. "A confession," he stammered. "Yes," I said. "A full confession. You are going to write down every single detail of your $40 million Ponzi scheme. You are going to list every single hidden offshore account you used. You are going to name every dummy corporation. You are going to explicitly state that you acted entirely alone, fully exonerating the early investors who unknowingly received stolen funds. You are going to sign a document that gives the federal government a complete roadmap to your fraud." Cameron shook his head in pure panic. "I cannot do that," he gasped. "If I sign a full confession, the prosecutors will not offer me a plea deal. They will give me the maximum penalty. I will get 15 years in a federal prison. I will lose half my life behind bars." "That is exactly the point," I said coldly. "You committed a massive federal crime. You ruined the financial lives of dozens of innocent people. You destroyed your own company. You are going to prison, Cameron. That is an absolute reality. The only choice you have left today is whether you go to prison alive or you die in the streets as a fugitive trying to buy a black market kidney. The silence in the office returned heavier and more suffocating than before. My mother let out a small, wounded whimper. She looked at Cameron, then looked at the stack of paper on my desk. She knew the game was completely over. She knew I had cornered him with absolute terrifying precision. "Harrison, please," Cameron begged, leaning heavily on his cane. "You are my brother. You cannot force me to lock myself in a cage for 15 years. There has to be another way. We can hire lawyers. We can fight the charges. I can rebuild." "There is nothing left to rebuild," I fired back, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "You have no company. You have no wife. Your church friends want you dead. The federal government has your passport and your bank accounts. You have absolutely nothing left except the air in your lungs, and even that is running out quickly. This is my offer. Sit down. Write the confession, accept your 15-year sentence, and I will pay to keep you alive. If you refuse, you can walk out of that door right now, and I will never speak to you again." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "I am not asking you twice, Cameron. Make your choice." I watched the last remaining ounce of arrogance completely drain out of my brother's body. For his entire life, he had relied on his superficial charm, his fake wealth, and his mother's unconditional protection to escape the consequences of his actions. He had always found a legal loophole. He had always found someone else to pay the price. But sitting in my corporate office, surrounded by the undeniable reality of my $60 million empire, there were no more loopholes. He looked at my mother, searching for a way out. She just looked away, staring blankly at the floor. She had no money to save him, and she had no power left to threaten me. Cameron let out a long, broken sob. He slowly dragged his feet across the carpet, leaning his entire body weight on his aluminum cane. He reached the edge of my desk and collapsed into the leather guest chair. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely pick up the fountain pen. He stared at the blank white paper for a full minute. He was looking at the absolute end of his golden life. He was looking at a decade and a half behind steel bars. He brought the pen down to the paper. "I address this confession to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission," he said out loud, his voice cracking with pure defeat as he began to write. "I, Cameron Thorne, do hereby admit to the deliberate, systematic orchestration of a $40 million financial fraud." I sat in silence and watched him write. I watched him detail the stolen funds. I watched him list the offshore accounts I had already completely emptied. I watched him write down the names of the innocent people he had defrauded, legally protecting them from federal asset seizure. It took him nearly 45 minutes to write the entire confession. His hand cramped. His breathing was incredibly shallow, and his tears stained the heavy parchment paper. When he finally reached the bottom of the last page, he stopped. He looked up at me, his face a portrait of absolute misery. "I signed it," he whispered. "Sign it and date it," I instructed him coldly. He scribbled his signature across the bottom of the page and wrote the date. He dropped the heavy fountain pen onto the desk. It landed with a soft thud. He pushed the stack of papers across the polished walnut wood toward me. I reached out and pulled the confession into my hands. I read through his messy, frantic handwriting, ensuring every single detail was legally accurate. He had admitted to everything. He had completely surrendered. He had officially traded his freedom for his life. I opened a thick manila folder sitting on the corner of my desk and placed his signed confession safely inside. I looked back at Cameron. He was slumped in the leather chair, looking incredibly small and frail. "I will contact the private dialysis clinic this afternoon," I told him. "They will expect you for your first treatment tomorrow morning. The bills will be routed directly to my accounting department. You will not have to worry about the cost." Cameron did not say thank you. He did not say anything at all. He just stared blankly at the wall, completely broken. I looked over at my mother. She was still standing near the door, clutching her cheap sweater. She looked like a ghost. She had spent her entire life worshiping the illusion of success, and now she was watching her golden child prepare for a 15-year federal prison sentence. "The meeting is over," I said, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "You both need to leave my office now." My mother slowly walked over to Cameron. She helped him stand up, supporting his weight as he gripped his cane. They did not look at me. They did not say goodbye. They slowly shuffled toward the heavy glass doors, a broken, defeated pair of criminals who had finally met the reality of their own actions. I watched them walk down the quiet corporate hallway, heading toward the elevator that would take them back down to their dented 15-year-old sedan. I had not given them forgiveness, and I had certainly not given them my kidney. I had simply forced them to pay the absolute brutal price for their own greed. The moment the heavy glass doors of my corporate office clicked shut behind my mother and my brother, the final chapter of their fraudulent empire began to close permanently. I did not waste a single second. I immediately handed Cameron's meticulously detailed signed confession directly over to the lead investigators at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal prosecutors did not even need to prepare for a lengthy, drawn-out trial. With his own handwritten admission of guilt explicitly laying out the entire $40 million Ponzi scheme, the legal proceedings were swift, clinical, and absolutely merciless. 2 weeks later, Cameron stood before a federal judge in a downtown Chicago courtroom. He was not wearing his custom-tailored suits or his imported Italian leather shoes. He was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a thick chain around his waist. The judge read the 15-year sentence with a cold, unwavering tone. There was no leniency offered. There was no sympathy for the tragic, dying entrepreneur narrative he had tried so desperately to sell to the world. The court recognized exactly what he was. He was a deeply manipulative, highly calculated corporate criminal who had intentionally defrauded his closest friends and his entire church congregation to fund an obscenely lavish lifestyle. The federal authorities immediately transferred Cameron to a highly secure federal medical center. This was a specialized federal penitentiary designed strictly for inmates with severe chronic health conditions. It was a universe away from the luxury VIP suite at Oakwood Memorial Hospital, where this entire nightmare had begun. There was no grand piano in the lobby. There were no fresh flowers delivered to his room every morning. There was no private concierge medical staff catering to his every single demand. Instead, Cameron now lives in a barren, fluorescent-lit medical ward, surrounded by thick cinder block walls and reinforced steel doors. 3 days a week, exactly on schedule, armed federal guards escort him to a sterile, freezing clinical room. They secure his wrist to a heavy medical chair, while a government nurse connects him to a standard dialysis machine. I kept my promise to the absolute letter of our agreement. I use a secure anonymous trust fund to pay the medical facility directly, ensuring he receives the exact standard of legal medical care required to keep him alive. He gets the baseline treatments to filter his failing blood, no more and no less. He will not get a black market kidney. He will not get an experimental treatment. He will sit in that uncomfortable plastic chair for 4 grueling hours at a time, watching the blood pump out of his body and back and listening to the monotonous hum of the medical machinery. He has absolutely nothing but time. He has 15 long years to sit in that cold room and think about the brother he threw into the dirt. He has thousands of hours to reflect on the fact that his physical survival is entirely dependent on the very man he tried to destroy. The golden child is trapped in a cage kept alive by the charity of the scapegoat he once laughed at. While Cameron pays for his crimes behind federal walls, the absolute reality of the collapse crashed down upon my mother with equally devastating force. The regional bank did not hesitate to execute the emergency foreclosure on her sprawling suburban home. The eviction was public and entirely humiliating. Judith had spent her entire adult life curating a pristine, flawless image of superior wealth and social dominance. She had looked down on anyone who could not afford her elite lifestyle. But when the county sheriff arrived to post the final eviction notice on her custom mahogany front doors, that entire carefully constructed identity was completely shattered. Judith was forced to pack a few remaining boxes of personal clothes and leave the luxury estate behind forever. With the federal government having frozen every single family account to pay back Cameron's defrauded investors, she had absolutely zero financial safety net. She moved into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment located above a noisy commercial laundromat on the far edge of the city limits. The walls are paper-thin. The floors creak with every step. There is no vaulted ceiling and no marble staircase. It is the exact kind of modest, struggling existence she used to actively mock me for living. But the financial ruin was only a fraction of her punishment. To pay her meager monthly rent and afford basic groceries, my mother had to enter the workforce for the first time in 4 decades. At 68 years old, Judith secured a job working the retail cosmetics counter at the exact same luxury high-end department store where she used to spend tens of thousands of dollars on weekend shopping sprees. Her new reality is a daily relentless exercise in absolute humiliation. Every single day she has to wear a standard black uniform and a plastic name tag. She has to stand on her feet for 8 agonizing hours arranging expensive perfumes and wiping down glass display cases. But the most brutal torture of all is the clientele. The wealthy socialites from Grace Fellowship, the women who used to attend her lavish charity dinners and kiss her on the cheek at Sunday morning services, frequently walk right through her department. When they approach the cosmetics counter, they do not smile at her. They do not ask how she is doing. They look directly through her, as if she is completely invisible. The mega-church congregation had officially erased her from their social registry. To them, she is simply the mother of the man who stole their retirement funds. They hand her their platinum credit cards without making eye contact, forcing her to process their transactions and hand them their shopping bags with a polite, mandatory retail smile. She traded her moral compass to protect a criminal illusion, and her reward is spending the rest of her life serving the people who now completely despise her. As for Jessica, the designer-clad wife who had gleefully handed me a $5 million lawsuit in the middle of a freezing scrapyard, her exit was swift and entirely cowardly. The moment she realized the federal government was seizing the offshore accounts, she filed for an emergency divorce. She desperately tried to distance herself from the Thorne family name, but the federal prosecutors were not easily fooled. They heavily audited her personal spending and determined she had knowingly benefited from the stolen money. She was stripped of all her luxury vehicles, her designer wardrobes, and her massive jewelry collection to help pay the restitution. She vanished from the city completely a broke and disgraced social climber forced to start entirely over from the bottom. The toxic roots of my family had been completely pulled out of the earth. The noise, the manipulation, and the relentless emotional blackmail were finally gone. I was standing in the quiet, peaceful aftermath of a hurricane holding the massive fortune my father had meticulously hidden for me. 6 months after I walked out of that hospital room and refused to be a sacrificial lamb, I stood on the open-air roof of the newly completed Walter Thorne Community Center. The sprawling state-of-the-art commercial plaza stretched out below me, completely transforming the desolate, abandoned industrial zone into a vibrant, thriving heart of the city. It was late afternoon, and the warm autumn sun was beginning to set over the Chicago skyline, casting a rich golden light across the new buildings. I leaned against the heavy glass railing and looked down into the large outdoor courtyard. The plaza was incredibly alive. I could see local business owners closing up their modern retail shops for the evening. I could hear the loud, joyful echoes of dozens of neighborhood kids playing basketball on the pristine indoor courts I had funded entirely with my own cash. I was wearing a simple, comfortable sweater and looking out at the empire I had built. I thought back to the freezing, terrifying nights I had spent locked inside that rusted, condemned storage unit. I thought about the bitter wind cutting through my thin clothes and the overwhelming feeling of absolute despair when I thought my life was completely over. I remembered staring at the blinking red light of the biometric floor safe, terrified that my own father had sent me to that wasteland as a final mocking insult. But as I stood in the warm sunlight, feeling the immense solid structure of the community center beneath my feet, I finally understood the absolute brilliance of my father's ultimate test. Walter Thorne was a hard, deeply flawed man. He had allowed my mother and my brother to cultivate an environment of extreme toxicity. He had stood silently by while they mocked me and treated me like a pathetic outcast. He had even participated in the initial theft of my $80,000 college fund. But somewhere along the line, as he watched Cameron's arrogance mutate into a massive federal crime, Walter realized his devastating mistake. He realized that giving a person unearned, unlimited wealth only destroys their character. He did not leave me the $60 million in a traditional bank account or a simple trust fund. If he had handed me that kind of massive fortune directly, Cameron and Judith would have immediately sued me for it. They would have dragged me into years of exhausting, expensive probate court litigation. They would have used their immense social power and their aggressive church connections to completely drain the funds before I ever had a chance to secure them. Instead, my father buried the true family legacy under layers of dirt rust and legal bankruptcy. He intentionally wrapped the greatest gift of my life in absolute humiliation. He knew that Cameron's boundless entitlement would prevent him from ever looking twice at a condemned storage facility. He knew my mother's obsession with luxury would keep her far away from the industrial slums. He left the secret to me because he knew I was the only person in the family who had been forced to learn how to survive at the very bottom. I was the only one who understood how to pick up the broken pieces of a ruined life and build something solid. He put me through the ultimate crucible, trusting that the immense heat of their betrayal would not burn me to ashes but would forge me into something completely unbreakable. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. I did not feel any lingering anger toward my brother sitting in his sterile prison ward, or my mother standing behind her retail counter. I did not feel any resentment toward my former fiancé, who had abandoned me when my bank account ran dry. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound, quiet gratitude. The universe had stripped away every single fake, toxic element of my existence to make room for the absolute truth. True wealth is never measured by the brand of your suit, the size of your house, or the superficial praise of a wealthy congregation. True wealth is the quiet, internal resilience to stand firm when the entire world is screaming that you are worthless. It is the courage to look at the people who have broken your heart and politely refuse to let them break your spirit. I turned away from the glass railing and walked toward the rooftop elevator. I was going back down to the ground floor to help the youth counselors lock up the basketball courts for the night. I was a man who had walked through the absolute darkest valley of family betrayal, and I had emerged on the other side holding the light. If you have ever been the scapegoat, if you have ever had your future stolen by the people who were supposed to protect you, do not let their labels define you. Sometimes the cruelest judgments prepare you to lead with strength no one expects. Hit the like button. Share this with someone fighting their own battles and subscribe for more stories about surviving the ultimate betrayals.